I'm just checking if we have Atsuko. Is Atsuko here somewhere? I saw her at lunch, but not yet. I'm sure she's over there. She's over there. I think that's, there she is. Right. Okay, so because as I said, we are on a very tight schedule. And if we run over, you are actually sacrificing drinks rather than lunch, so that is significantly worse. We don't want to run that risk. This afternoon, it's labeled DFI Forum. I think never in Africa's history have so many DFIs been reunited under one roof, I believe. It's every imaginable DFI, as far as I know, is present here today or tomorrow. So I was joking to somebody, if a bomb would fall on this building today, what would happen with the world with so many DFIs here? This afternoon, we are going to concentrate on the role of DFIs, and I'm sure we might have some interesting exchanges, because I've already picked up some critical and constructive voices. We start with a series of talks or presentations. It's same format, fairly condensed. That will set the scene for then subsequently 2 panels. One I will moderate myself. It's somewhat taking stock of where we are, and the other one looking forward. Quite elaborate, extensive panels with large representation. But without further ado, I would like to invite Atsuko Toda, who is Director of Agricultural Finance and Rural Development, Africa Development Bank, based in Côte d'Ivoire. And I know Atsuko from a number of other occasions. She's extremely passionate and a knowledgeable person when it comes to agriculture in Africa. She has expressed the desire of also receiving maybe some questions and some critical observations. So even in the middle of her speaking, if you find yourself having a question or disagreeing, don't hesitate your hand. That's how I've been instructed, isn't it, Atsuko? So with that, I hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Frank. You're so much taller than me, so I'm going to just adjust this first of all. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's really such an honor to be speaking to you. This morning when we started on all the different topics around PPPs with all the excellent speakers and just the diversity of people here, I think this is so exciting. So it's absolutely an honor to be here. So I've been asked to speak alongside Peter Neal and Natalia about some of the main lessons learned from past experiences in terms of DFI investment and what has worked well. Okay, so a lot of things have, been happening in Africa. I think if you look at the different continents in terms of really trying to get work going, Africa is the place to be, and there's so much that we need to do. In terms of what we've been doing at the African Development Bank as the head of Agri business investments and rural infrastructure investments, I've been doing with the team, and I'm just wondering if the team is here, if Richard and the team are here. Okay, they're not here. We've been doing 3 main things. Number 1 is we've been investing in companies, agribusinesses across Africa. And this has been really exciting, but challenging, because as was spoken this morning, sometimes when we want to invest in agribusinesses as development finance institutions, we have internal processes which include negotiating with the credit risk committees within our own organizations. So one of the challenges has been, as DFIs, as I'm sure that in commercial banks they have this issue, agriculture as a portfolio is much more difficult to invest in. So our investment teams really do have to go out there and look for deals that actually pose the right level of risk and return profile that we can invest in as a development finance institution. Number two, when we're doing agribusiness investments, we are open to business. So I just would like to highlight with my fellow DFIs, we are very much wanting to invest in companies like yours. But we do, as DFIs, also have pretty heavy informational requirements. So to work with a DFI like the African Development Bank means a partnership, means that there is long-term capital that we can offer to you, but it also means that there are a number of informational requirements, including financial, E&S, which are much heavier and which take a lot more time in processing than you might find with a commercial bank. I think the third big challenge has been about looking for pipeline. And deal sourcing has not been easy. There are more institutions today that are ready to help with deal sourcing, so I'm really looking forward to working with those organizations and partnering, as was discussed this morning. But I really do feel, for example, in Southern Africa, we need more deals. As the African Development Bank, we would love to do many more deals in Southern Africa. And just speaking with Norman of Agri earlier, one of the things that's so exciting about South Africa is that there is a lot of skill, a lot of companies that actually have done great work here. So why not now expand markets, bring your skills to other markets? And also, when we look at the issues around currency, it is so important that the diversified portfolio of markets is there for companies. So we'd really like to see much more pipeline, including that of Southern Africa. And so really, I hope that today, one of the things that we can do is talk to the companies that are here to think through what are their financial needs and how, as DFIs, with EBRD, with FMO, how we can find ways to finance more. Part of that conversation is really about structuring also. One of the things that we're learning about structuring any deal, though, is that it's, and maybe this is a little bit what Alex was talking about, de-risking a deal is not enough. It's really about the financial performance of the company. And so sometimes as we try to de-risk and as we try to structure a lot of these deals, one question we ask ourselves is, can we do this transaction? Can we take this, is this a risk that we can incur? And the other one is about how do we structure to make it happen? So our teams do work with companies to be able to structure some of these deals and support that. But I think that's another important part of what we as DFIs will do with companies. More recently, we have set up an Agri SME catalytic financing mechanism side by side with the Agri corporate financing that we do. And I think that is going to be a game changer, but we did need to seek for concessional resources from the Government of Canada, in this case, to be able to set up this catalytic financing mechanism. It's taken a while. Actually, we're trying to set up another blended finance mechanism with IDH, but it takes time. It takes really a lot of time. So the transaction costs of setting these blended financing facilities is actually quite great. And so as much as I am all for blended finance, I'm also wanting people to understand that it does take time. And therefore, if we do have structures that we can, or blended finance facilities that we can support, that we believe in the objectives, I believe it's good to invest in together. Ultimately, we want to reach more companies, we want to reach more SMEs, so that's the idea that we would go forward with. But I really would like to be able to actually highlight that. The third area that we're working on as the African Development Bank is actually special agro-industrial processing zones. You may have heard our president, President Adesina, talk about these special agro-industrial processing zones. It's been a journey. We started in about 2017. And the idea is to set up the backbone infrastructure that we are talking about this morning in rural areas where there is a marketable surplus, and try to create the infrastructure around the aggregation platforms, the transformation centers, industrial hub, so that companies can invest. So really de-risking the private sector investment, particularly for medium-sized enterprises. With larger enterprises, maybe they don't need that much backbone infrastructure, but this is what we have been trying to do for the last 5 years. And what's very interesting is that governments immediately commit to the idea. Governments want to transform and agro-industrialize. But what we quickly actually meet are challenges of, like, when we're trying to build the infrastructure, actually public sector does take a lot of time. So how do we get contractors which actually can have equity in the game? How do we work with developers that have a sense of ownership and want to try to finish the infrastructure quickly? 2, we also run into problems of supply chain management, logistics. And sometimes when we have a government ownership of this special agro-industrial processing zone, one of the challenges we face is that the government entity may not understand the private sector. So we've been really innovating the model over the last period, but I think the government of Ethiopia has taken a very strong stance to move this forward. The government of Senegal, we also set it up in Côte d'Ivoire. We're working with Nigeria also. There's a number of initiatives also that we are supporting in DRC, in Mali, and Guinea. There's so many countries that have asked us to support, and we're financing, but we really think that these kind of models require, on the infrastructure side, to have much more private sector engagement, and then also to be able to promote investment. But we are currently working on those. And with the Southern Africa region, we're working in Zambia. South Africa has also asked us to put a transaction advisor. But it's one of those things where, you're really trying to take infrastructure policy together and provide a working environment for private sector. I'd just like to say one more thing, Frank, if that's okay. We come to this Agri Indaba because as development finance institutions, we really believe that we can do more for private sector to support the growth of your companies. That's number 1. 2, we sincerely believe that by coming together once a year, Agri Indaba is the place to come to have these conversations. 3, right now, if you look at Africa and some of the statistics that were mentioned this morning in the presentations, Africa is importing a lot of staples that it doesn't need to import. So if we can focus on a number of countries, a number of production hotspots, and really get public and private to work together, there is an opportunity to accelerate or unleash the food potential of Africa. So in that context, we have been asking to work with others to be able to identify concrete country compacts whereby we can say that this is an action plan around particular staples. Let's work together, let's raise the financing, let's get the right partners, public and private, and be able to do this. The African Development Bank with the African Union is going to host something in Senegal at the end of January next year. But I really feel that Agri Indaba is a very important event in the context of actually getting there. So I hope that in these 2 days, we can really come up with concrete partnerships, ideas to accelerate the food and agricultural production of this continent. Think not only about South Africa, but beyond, because the skills, the potential is here. And we look forward to finding specific actions that we can do together. Thank you very much.
Definitely ready for the TED Talk circuit. Fantastic. Atsuko, you said a couple of things that I thought were, I hope that will come back either in the panel discussion of which you will be a part. The African Development Bank is an African institution and has therefore a particular kind of leverage and credibility when it comes to pushing governments and government institutions to a level of higher accountability and higher capability. So it was very interesting that the African development is really working on that, and I hope that at some point it comes back like, what's the progress? How does it compare to where we were 2 years ago? Because this obviously is very critical. I would like to go on to the next speaker, and that is Pieter Nel Bogaert. He is the Global Head Agribusiness, Food and Water, FMO. Food and Water FMO, the Netherlands. You know why I was so surprised that I looked at you? I thought it was a man.
It's a good surprise.
Thank you. No, it's because of the name, I mean, Pieter Nel. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. As you mentioned, I'm from FMO, the Dutch Development Bank. A lot of countries almost every country in Europe has a development bank, also the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is also very much an agricultural country, so therefore we also have an agricultural department. We invest about 500 to 600 million each year in the agricultural sector worldwide. And our aim is to see if we can help not only with finance, but also with advice and knowledge and our network to improve the situation in the different countries. So they asked us to, not just me, but me and the team, there are a couple of representatives here of FMO, to make an analysis of the challenges of Africa and the food system, because there are a couple of challenges, and I believe there's also a presentation that should be visible. Can you hear me? Okay. So, bear with me, please. I think that's the wrong green. Yes. The title is not very politically correct, you may think. It says, what's wrong with the current food system? It should maybe be more, what are the challenges? But at the same time, I do think something is wrong, because the African continent is not self-sufficient in food. About calculations state, and those are conservative calculations, that more than 80 billion worth of food is being imported in Africa, while there's so much potential to grow your own food on this continent. So what is wrong? One of the things that I hope you see visualized here correctly or understandably is that the farmers, there are many farmers in Africa, hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers. And that is immediately the issue in the chain, because after that you have the middlemen, after that you have the primary processors and the traders, and some flows go for export and some flows go for the local market. But where the start of everything, the primary agriculture, is divided over a lot of smallholders. And it immediately shows that there's a lack of economies of scale there. One smallholder farmer does not have a very good negotiating position towards a middleman, so you have to aggregate, or smallholders need to aggregate through cooperatives, for instance, but that's today very often not the case. The other challenge is informal land ownership. It is a challenge for banks, more than for the people themselves, but it is a challenge. There's also a lack of mechanization. I was struggling to see what was mentioned there. And technical skills very often. Access to finance as a result is an issue. And smallholders, of course, are also very vulnerable to climate change. And in addition, being vulnerable to climate change, smallholder farmers also contribute to the climate change, unfortunately, because of their needs for land and deforestation as a result. So a lot of challenges for smallholders, and I can probably, you know, even more challenges than I can summarize here. So I think it's better to go to what we see as solutions, and then I will finish with some nice examples of what is possible. With some delay. Yes. So what needs to change, I already mentioned it, aggregation is very important. Through cooperatives or land consolidation where possible, so that you can negotiate with your buyers, but also get irrigation and mechanization and get the tools to adapt and become more resilient against climate change. And as a result, also have access to finance. As a result, or not as a result, but the next step, the middleman or the in-between, the aggregators, should also do the same and aggregate, so that they have a negotiating position towards the traders and the primary processors and the food market. Moving on to some examples that we've seen, and it's not just in South Africa, but the first one is a very nice one in Nigeria. It's a company called Babangona that we finance as well. They aggregated thousands and thousands of smallholders. They provide them with inputs, with finance, with advice. They buy the crops and they market the crops to the primary processors. We have Yalelo, which was a greenfield aquaculture company in Zambia. And today it's one of the largest integrated tilapia producers around, using for a big portion local feed and selling the fish fresh in Zambia and Uganda instead of the countries needing to import the frozen, often Chinese fish. Another example is closer to home, that's United Export, a blueberry company. Also a large company by now, growing, using a mix of their own farms, joint ventures and outgrowers to also produce blueberries for the local market, but mainly for the export. And the nice thing about this company is also that it's very much focused on climate adaptation and climate mitigation, not only in its primary production, but especially on its transportation, because a lot of people think blueberries are shipped via plane, but United Export is doing 90% of that or even more via shipping. The last one on this overview is Niche, that I would like to mention. This is a local cocoa processing company in Ghana. Ghana and Ivory Coast are together responsible for more than 60% of production of cocoa beans, and there's hardly, I don't think there's any local cocoa processing company that is owned by a local. This is one of the few, and we're helping them to grow into a more professional, even larger company. And today, it's one of the first African companies that actually invested in the US and in Europe to process the cocoa even further. These are the 4 examples I wanted to share with you to also show you that there is hope to overcome all these enormous challenges. And I encourage you to reach out to anybody from the FMO team. We have our own booth here on the Indaba Agri. I'm very happy to, we are very happy to receive you there. So if you have any further questions, please do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pieter. And it's good to finish with these 4 examples of successes. At some point, it would be interesting if we come to some insight as to why were these examples successful as compared to the many failures that we have come across. So what is the distinguishing feature that made this successful? Because for almost every of these examples, I'm sure many of us know an example in the same sector that didn't work out, whether it's in blueberry farming in Zimbabwe or cacao processing in Ghana. So what has been the distinguishing feature that made these examples successful? So very interesting, thank you. The last speaker before we go into panels is Natalia Zhukova. Natalia is the Director, Head of Agribusiness, EBRD in the UK. Welcome, Natalia. Do you have slides? No. Okay.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Very nice to meet you all, and it's a pleasure for me. Unlike 2 previous speakers, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, I would say, is a baby in Africa finance world. We are only operating in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. We expect and hope that we will move to West and East Africa, more countries over the next 3 years. But I was asked to talk slightly about how we mix policy dialogue agenda with our private sector projects. Just to say that at EBRD, we finance pretty much 100% private sector companies. We don't do PPPs. We have never done such things. What we have done historically is probably a couple of sovereign projects over the last 30 years. We invest on average 850 million in about 50, 60 projects in our 38 countries of operations, including 3 in Africa. And in Africa, so far, unlike others who talked this morning, and today we only invested above 825 million in 45 projects in the 3 countries that I mentioned. So starting, maybe I will go just to a few practical examples on what and how we are doing together with the private sector projects. Let's start with capital market developments. For example, in the Baltics, we have been very instrumental in terms of launching commercial paper, which is a short-term marketable instrument, working with the central banks of 3 countries in the Baltic republics. We also participated in the primary issuances of this commercial paper to bring confidence to investors. We will not stay there for long, because for us the main issue is to launch the market and have it operationalize it, if I may say so. Similarly, we have developed, for example, in Turkey, the corporate bond framework, where we were buying, where we were investing in local currency fixed coupon bonds issues, which were subscribed by Turkish corporates, excluding banks or non-bank financial institutions. And then we supported, in this way, the sector, extending the tenors and maturities that our clients were getting. And again, we were participating and subscribing in these issuances of the bonds at the initial stages of the market development. We led policy dialogue in a number of countries to develop more stable and predictable market indices on which you base your floating rates for the loans that then private sector receives. It really helps to bring transparency and more predictability, because a lot of indices that existed in Turkey or elsewhere in a number of countries were based on totally non-market swaps or operations, and this we changed. We supported, for example, in Tajikistan, which is a small Central Asian country, a French retailer. And as part of these private sector operations, we launched the policy dialogue with the government of Tajikistan to introduce changes and introduce new tax code. We do it with our legal transition team jointly. Obviously, we as bankers don't have enough expertise to do it. But this private sector project launched and triggered the major change in a very small country. If we look at a number of countries historically, we were quite instrumental in introducing warehouse receipts, which you can use as a pledge to the banks. We established these markets, for example, in Kazakhstan and Serbia historically, and it gave way more access and better financing options for many farmers in the region. Now, moving to the grain sector and maybe a bit of Africa, let's look at Egypt. What we have done in the grain sector as part of financing our private sector clients in Egypt, we have engaged in extensive public-private policy dialogue. As a result, what we saw, the Egyptian Grain Suppliers Association was established. Our private clients got a voice and a platform to talk to the government about improvements in the supply chain and this sector. Regulation on costly inspections at points of shipment was changed. We can proudly say that the number of required documents went down by 3 times, which is a major achievement, because imagine an exporter from Ukraine willing to supply grain to Egypt, which will always stay a net grain importer, struggling to supply a huge amount of documents. We also launched, as part of our private sector deals with our clients, we launched jointly with FAO an introduction of international e-phytosanitary certificates. It's still a work in progress, but it will mean that in the end, the region will go paperless, and it will save 200,000 paper phytosanitary certificates each year to process grain cargoes. In Ukraine, historically, another example of policy dialogue and private sector participation or financing with our private sector clients, if you look historically at Ukraine, grain producers and investors were always adversely affected by very often unpredictable policy decisions of the government. There were a lot of situations when grain export quotas were introduced, certain bans were announced. So we did, again, jointly with FAO, from 2009, we have been systematically working on improving the situation, analyzing the market, pushing the government to do evidence-based rather than, kind of out of the blue or political decision-making. We made sure that transparency of the grain market is increased. As a result, you all know that Ukraine is a breadbasket of Europe. You know that, and of many countries as well. You know that Ukraine supplies 37% of the global sunflower oil production, and they became leading global supply of grains. They're exporting 57, 60 plus million tons of grains, while in 2007-8, when we started, they were only exporting 4 million. There was, and of course, we relaunched this grain policy dialogue in Ukraine and a number of other countries when COVID came, because everyone saw disruption of supply chains. Now, even more so with the war in Ukraine, we are looking quite a lot in terms of how we can improve trading routes. And when investment needs to be done, because Black Sea ports, okay, there is a very limited opportunity for export, so other routes have to be explored. Food security was mentioned today quite a lot. I said that we were financing a couple of sovereign deals. This year, we have given 150 million to ODC in Tunisia, which is a government-owned entity. This is not our role to finance such deals per se, but because of the price spikes, because of the increased working capital needs, we did this transaction. But this transaction is actually conditional on a sector reform roadmap that we developed for the company and for the government, and we are working on it again together with FAO, looking at making sure that there is full transparency in terms of procurement practices, that there will be certain action plan formulated after full analysis is finished. The ultimate goal is actually for us to make sure that there is a partial spin-off of government-controlled procurement, which is given to private sector players. And of course, it will help Tunisia to reach resilience to future shocks, because we see such things happening more and more. It will also allow ODC, this Office de Cereal, to become more commercialized in their operations and in the end more competitive. We all know that there are a lot of negative specifics from environmental, climate change, environmental footprint and other things. This is very high on agenda. This is why all our investments in livestock aim to replace unsustainable and inefficient practices. Again, we financed quite a number of players from this perspective. What do we do from the policy perspective? We have developed a regional livestock, sustainable livestock program. Again, talking about Ukraine as an example, we have been successfully working for a number of years in mitigating African swine fever-related risk. We have improved legislation. There were changes made. We have made sure that we invested in the capacity of laboratory infrastructure across the country. We were consistently increasing the awareness of people and farmers on this risk, and we're promoting investments in higher biosecurity. And this is very important. In the end, it allowed us to continue investments in livestock, albeit on a selected basis. And talking about climate change, these things obviously need to be looked at from the perspective on net positive impact, but this works. You all know that olive oil sector in Tunisia, Morocco, okay, not exactly a region, but Jordan and West Bank, Gaza is very important. What have we done there? And we finance quite a number of companies in this sector. We have done policy dialogue on food safety and quality. We have done quite a lot working with a lot of small farmers, introducing STAR program to rate the quality of olive oil. We engaged in policy dialogue through technical workshops, but also we did quite a lot in export promotion, taking our clients to countries. For example, historically, we have quite a large portfolio in food retail. For us, agribusiness covers the entire value chain. It's not only focused on primary agri. We have taken all our clients, say from Morocco to Poland, to other countries, to Germany, because we have worked with largest retailers in Europe, including Schwarz Group, you know, probably Lidl and Kaufland supermarkets. So they all went there and saw how products should be marketed, how things have to be presented. We do a lot of business match from this perspective because we know how we operate and where we operate. I think that maybe a couple of last points because I think I have 1 minute left or something like this. We've done quite a lot in dairy sector in Kazakhstan, again, jointly with FAO, introducing digital tools for farmers to report, even at farmers of 3 cows level, to report the quality, quantity of milk that they have, which worked really well. A lot was talked about inclusion today as well. We all know that if women farmers couldn't, if they could have access to the same productive resources as men do globally, they can increase the farm yields by 20 to 30%. So we work a lot in terms of inclusion with vocational institutions, with universities, but again via our private sector projects. For example, we worked with a multinational trader in Turkey to set up a nationally accredited training program to improve skills for women in olive oil. And this is kind of taken at the highest level. We worked with local universities to make sure that they improve and move away from very theoretical curriculum to agronomy degrees which have really practical application, which are dictated by our clients. We are not telling them, because we are bankers, how to do it. It's really matching private sector clients and these vocational schools. We work a lot also on geographical indicators in a number of countries. So obviously more can be done, but I just wanted to give you a few practical examples on how you can really mix and achieve practical results, mixing policy dialogue and private sector investment, and not necessarily talking to governments on very abstract things. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. One of the things that might strike also some of you, but it certainly strikes me after attending these conferences for many, many years, is how little there is cross-referencing to other regions, like learning, what did we learn about the integration of Eastern Europe in the European market, how I'm fortunate enough or unfortunate enough to be old enough to remember the challenges of integrated Polish agriculture in the European common market, because there were also still many smallholders there. So often in these kind of conferences, there's very little reference to what have we learned from Europe, from Asia, etc., and maybe that will come back further into the discussion. Also, one example I think of where we might have to do a little bit more studying of the past and other region is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I'm always utterly surprised about how easy we believe that this is going to be transformational in itself. Anybody who is a little bit familiar with what happened in Europe knows that if it wouldn't have been for the cross transfers of financial resources and Germany helping Poland to get up to stream, and it would not have worked. So just opening up your borders without a framework in which the stronger ones are going to help the weaker ones, it gets stuck. That's what the European experience has shown. And yet, I have a feeling that we often don't talk enough about that. So also that hopefully comes back somewhere further into the discussion. We have now, and we are brilliantly on time. So I have good news for the audience. I'm sure that there will be time for questions, even more. As far as my panel is concerned, if you do want to raise a question, even during the panel session, because it pertains to the topic that we're talking, raise your hand and get a mic and shout, okay? So the panel that I will be moderating, we are going to do a little bit of stock taking, looking at where we are, and it's labeled, how do DFIs support the private sector? The second panel, led by Alex Kaufman, moderated by him, it will look more into the new mechanisms and the future. It will not always be easy to separate these two topics. Let's see how it goes. I would like to invite my panel members up here. Hans Bogart, Richard Ofoy, Jean Abbé, Otto Winter, Andreas Davidson, Teddy Onserlo, Susan Payne, Martin Kromat, and Johnny Hansen. Now you probably understand why we don't have the wide sofas, because we couldn't get that many sofas on here. Which is proof that the best innovations always starts from a crisis, because I think many people have said that this is so much better than the sofas, but the idea came actually from the realization we didn't have enough space. So I want this to be a little bit of a free-flowing conversation. I hope that you don't all agree on everything. I'm sure that some of you those who are from the private sector will not necessarily agree with what the DFIs are saying, hopefully. And as I said, from the public, from the audience, if you want to interject, feel free to do so. I wanted to first start with a short introduction, so if each of you could give 1 or 2 lines on yourself, the organization you stand for, and the role. Hans?
Is it now? Yeah, that's better. Hans Bogart, I'm the manager of the Africa team of the FMO Food and Agri Business Department. And before that, more than 20 years with Rabobank. And the common denominator is rural development and how to promote that through financing. Thanks.
Hi. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Richard Ofurimanti. I'm the division manager for Agri and Rural Finance of the African Development Bank, where I lead a team of investment officers to finance agribusiness transactions on the continent.
I'm Jean Abbé. I'm from the International Finance Corporation, the subsidiary of the World Bank dedicated to the private sector. I am the lead for food, agriculture, and forestry within the upstream division, which is a kind of incubator for projects or companies not yet ready to be backed by the IFC or other investors. Most of my career I spent in private equity in Africa, including quite a few years on the sector.
Yes, my name is Otto Christensen. I'm coming from IFU, the Danish DFI, and we have been investing for 55 years in the emerging markets across the various continents. I have not been part of that all the time, only for the last 8 years, heading the sustainable food systems teams out of Copenhagen, covering the full value chain in the agribusiness. So pleased to be here.
Good afternoon. My name is Andreas Davidson. I'm head of agribusiness and manufacturing in Norfund, which is the Norwegian DFI. We've been investing for 25 years, so not as long as my colleague here, but as such, we are younger and more agile. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Teddy Onserio. I represent the United States Development Finance Corporation, so DFC. We've been investing for 2 years. However, most of you may know us from our predecessor agency, OPIC. So I represent DFC in East Africa, covering all sectors, including our food securities investment work.
My name is Susan Payne. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Holistic Agricultural Investments Group. It is a permanent capital vehicle that invests in VC and early stage growth equity for agricultural projects in sub-Saharan Africa, which we co-own and frequently operate.
Good afternoon. My name is Martin Kromat. I'm a senior partner at Patisa. Patisa is a sector-focused private equity fund manager, currently investing our third fund, ironically called Patisa Food Fund 2, looking at investments in the food value chain, just short of $150 million. Our investors are quite a few DFIs, as well as some commercial investors. Thank you.
And I have the advantage of being both, having been an LP and also being a GP now. So my name is Johnny Hansen. I had the honor of working with Otto at IFU until I jumped the fence and joined one of the private equity funds that IFU had invested in. So I head up value creation at Sebo Investment Partners. We are a dedicated food security fund investing in SME projects across the continent.
Fantastic. So we have quite a wide spectrum, and I said it this morning, I'm still so pleasantly surprised about the really wide response of DFIs across the globe that is present here. So let's first establish a little bit of facts. I tried to find out how important are DFIs actually in Africa. And I found a number that something like 50 billion is committed to Africa development. Has anybody a better number? Anybody has any better statistics than this? Anybody has an idea? How much money are we talking about, all DFIs? The 50 billion might be correct. Commitments, so it's not what is annually invested.
Maybe if I may, I think it's important to distinguish between the primary agricultural sector and
I'm talking total. Not only agriculture, total DFI commitments to Africa. I picked up the number 50 billion.
Sorry. Well, I will just probably maybe just look at the African Development Bank's lending program for a year, and I think that would give an example of what an individual sort of DFI is doing. I think we have a lending program of about 6 billion a year. So we're doing 6 billion and we have all these DFIs lined up, then probably what you're saying in terms of commitment in a year could be just around the same.
It could make sense, right? BII, 2 billion. And so if you all add up 50 billion, so just to underscore that, we are talking here in total as a very important actor or factor in the development of Africa, certainly in the context of the 50 or 70 billion, we are not all agreeing as to what is needed for agricultural land. So very substantial. Now, VFIs are both development institutions, but they also want to be catalytic. So I would like to get a perspective of how important do you see that role of being just a development investor in its own right, or in how far that you see your role as being catalytic and drawing in other private equity or private money. Anybody who volunteers from the DFI side to make a comment on that? If not, I will call on Jean.
I'll take that one. And one thing I would say is that there is a need for working more to incubate projects. There is a lot of money coming from DFIs, but often though this money is dedicated to organizations that are already very solid and able to absorb the quantum of capital we tend to be able to deliver, which is typically a few $1 million and often a few dozens of millions of dollars. Unfortunately, a lot of companies, organizations, a project can't absorb those kind of capital, at least without taking the unduly risk. And so one of the answers to that gap between the demand from private sector players and the offer of capital is from the IFC is to create a division that's called Upstream, which is a kind of incubator. And I can expand a bit on that with a few examples of what we do. But the logic of it is to take those sponsors, organizations, entrepreneurs that have a project but don't have necessarily the capacity to execute on it, to help them get to a stage where they can be backed by DFI or commercial investors.
Richard, for African Development Bank, are you acting as a pure private equity or pure investor, or do you want to be catalytic in the sense for every dollar you want to also bring another dollar along?
Well, I think it's important that, the role that we play, we tend to be catalytic in most of the roles that we play within the investment environment in which we work. One, I mean, from just a catalytic point, you'd realize that the projects that we invest in provide some synthetic form of political risk mitigation, in the sense that, by having the African Development Bank or any of our sister DFIs like the World Bank, the IFC, in those projects, we have that umbrella of political risk mitigation where a country would not act otherwise on a particular project in which the bank has invested in. Also, from a catalytic perspective, I would give an example of opening up or bringing in foreign direct investments into countries, especially our fragile and transition countries where there is coming out of risk, coming out of conflict, etc., where there's limited foreign direct investment. But by having the private sector wing of the African Development Bank go into such countries, we are able to catalyze and bring in and crowd in additional level of finance. And a case in point is Sudan. We did our first transaction in Sudan in 2018. And following that, you would see that there's a huge sort of interest into Sudan, into looking at various private sector-led opportunities out there. So that's some of just the catalytic sort of interventions that we provide.
Yeah, and I'll come to the private sector perspective on that. I just wanted to go around the DFIs to see how they, Hans, yes. And with FMO also make reference to these 4 examples of successes. Is that projects, for example, that traditional private equity or traditional investors would not have done without the involvement of FMO?
Probably all of those 4 would qualify for that. I think it's good to also note that the situation in Sub-Saharan Africa is maybe a bit behind what we see in South America, where it's quite normal to catalyze the private sector, banks like Rabobank, ING, etc. But in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think we are still having to catalyze ourselves almost with blended finance structures. And you see still too much gathering of DFIs together, which is, so I think for us is the responsibility to be more active and to take our private banking friends with us. But the 4 cases that I showed you, it's not yet the case. And hopefully in the next 2 years, we will introduce commercial banks.
Otto?
Yeah, just a few comments from my end. Being one of the smallest DFIs, 2 billion under management, not a lot, but the most of what we are doing is equity. And equity is key for, let's say, levering up the company and therefore providing the needed equity in a certain company so that they can get the working capital facilities and this and that from either DFI colleagues or in the ordinary banking market. So equity is key for many companies.
Yeah. Andreas?
For us, it starts with value creation. We want to be a catalyst for value creation, and value creation and development go hand in hand. And we also believe if you are successful with the businesses, you will catalyze through other investors coming in, seeing the returns, but also seeing the opportunities. So in all of our projects, it starts with value creation. What can we get out of this business? How can we develop it so that it's stronger and better a few years from now? And that is one way to catalyze. Another way is through equity. As Otto says, we have at least 70% of our investments is equity investments, which can catalyze debt providers as well. And additionally, I think to be someone who paves the way for institutional and strategic investors when it comes to ESG and business integrity, because many of these investors are afraid of investing in Africa because of these reasons. But having a DFI going in first puts a stamp of approval and make it possible for these more risk-averse investors to come in later.
Teddy?
Great, thanks. DFC has about 9 billion committed in the continent. And when we were formed, we added 2 tools, that's equity and technical assistance, to our toolbox. So you've heard about the importance of equity and having equity, or having a DFI as an equity investor. The technical assistance bit enables us to invest in opportunities where we have interest in, but have otherwise identified 1 or 2 hurdles that need to be sorted out before our debt capital or equity capital can come in. So those 2 tools have been very, very helpful. In addition to that, we have traditionally been giving guarantees to traditional financiers for them to lend to sectors that they would otherwise have found to be higher risk. So for example, we have various guarantees with banks to lend into the agriculture space, SMEs, women-owned businesses, etc. For Agri in particular, we noticed very low uptake, for that particular product, because if there's no support, then how are the bankers supposed to evaluate the risks? As we know, one of the biggest challenges is just the uncertainty that comes with the agricultural value chain. So we ended up partnering with other US government agencies, USAID in particular, and we had a lot of training happening to these traditional financiers. So that TA really basically massively changed the utilization of our guarantees for the banks to lend to the agricultural sector. So I think technical assistance now tied particularly to enabling local financial channels to sort of able to financially basically box the risks that they are facing and increase or grow their portfolios in these challenging sectors is also key.
Thank you. Susan, you have already informed me that you have a critical perspective on what DFIs do and can do in Africa. So what's your perspective on this critical role they play, or are they just a competitor in the private equity sector?
Well, I think we have to look at what the definition is of a DFI and what development capital is and what DFIs bring to the table for those of us that operate smaller operations that require funding of between $2 and $10 million. That bracket is the backbone of any economy. That is the SME bracket, and heretofore, it has been largely ignored. And that's the problem. So I'm standing here now representing a whole swathe of people that speak to me regularly that can't access funding from DFIs, not because there isn't a huge impetus for DFIs and their support of African agriculture. That is guaranteed. It's how that disconnect occurs. There is an absolute disconnect between the demand, on the one hand, from the backbone of the economy, and the supply, and there is a lot of supply on the other hand. How do we put those two together? And that's a problem that we face, because when we look at this and we stand at 50,000 feet and look at this equation, this is a continent, and we know all of the numbers, but just remember the number 40. 40% of this continent lives without electricity. 40% of this continent lives in extreme poverty. And 40% of this continent has an age bracket of under 15 years old, which means there is a very potent demographic right now, right here, that is going to be seeking a job in what is now seen to be a fairly unsexy industry, basically marshaled by 60-year-old men, because that is the average age group that inhabits this space. So unless we do something fairly dramatic to feed this backbone, and we do something that connects the DFI money to groups like mine and multiple hundreds of others, then we are going to fail. And you can't find women like me in bars on a Saturday night. That's not where you find me. You find me in networks. You find women like me, and there are many, many women like me that are in all sorts of different spaces around Africa that are very dedicated to make agriculture work. And if there is an impetus to give money to Gender Lens, then this is it. We have to find these people, and they're not they're not difficult to uncover. They're easy to uncover.
I'm sure we'll come back to that. Martin, is Fatisa not one of these conduits from the big DFIs to the small funds? Is that not solving what Susan refers to? Or?
To a certain extent, although I don't want to take anything away from what Susan said, because I think she's made some really good points, but I do want to give the DFIs some credit. And maybe,
Absolutely, yes.
Maybe start with, I think we're only going to solve this problem if we attract more investment from outside of Africa and more investment from inside of Africa. And I mentioned in my introduction, we have some commercial investors in our funds, and that's great, but there should be much more. I think, and to pick up Andreas's point, it is about proving that the model works and that private equity actually can return decent IRRs, and it's all about the value creation. And I'm very thankful to the DFIs for having seeded a number of fund managers and for giving ourselves, as an example, the support in a second fund. And I think that's quite important. And collectively, I think we need to prove it, that this is a successful model and we can make it work. And so that's I think, a key role. And I wish we would get more investments from outside of Africa, but again, financial institutions inside of Africa who have funds to invest are not yet giving us the support we need, presumably because they see this as too risky at this stage. And that's what we need to prove, that the risk comes with commensurate returns. I want to also pick up something that Teddy said, so in the technical assistance space. And again, that's something that we've benefited from as a fund manager, where we've, in our first fund, technical assistance was made available, and I think we deployed that very successfully, and it really helped to accelerate the growth of some of our businesses. And again, very thankful to some of the DFIs who've just now given us access to a technical assistance facility in our fund too, and we'll again do the same and use that to really accelerate the success of our businesses and hopefully prove the point that we can generate decent returns.
Well, what's the ticket size? So you get a big chunk of money from a DFI and then you cut it up. So how far do you cut it up? So what's the sort of ticket sizes that? And what's an example of how far can it be cut up? How far does it go? To Susan's point, like.
So I guess I'll leave the kind of more SME focus to Johnny to talk about. In our fund, it's manageable to do about 8 to 9 investments, and we'll probably have on average about $15 million invested in each deal.
Still big tickets.
So it's slightly bigger than, I guess, Zebu has.
Yeah. Johnny? And also say something about how important are the DFIs for you from where you sit.
Yeah, no, to Martin's point, I think we are exactly that vehicle that can be the conduit for investments in Africa. I mean, us having boots on the ground, it's not all private equity funds, but both Patisa and Cebu has value creation teams. So we work closely with our management teams and can improve, implement some of the very strict but good governance structures that are imposed on us having DFI money, pursuing some of the ESG targets that are can sometimes be seen very important to the developed world, but then trying to implement those in the emerging and developing world as well. So DFIs are a very important conduit for that.
And this is a model that most of you consider optimal, like, of course DFIs can't go to 1 million ticket size, so they give it to a fund, the fund gives it to operators like Zebu.
Yeah,
we all think this is, in terms of the stream of capital, is that an optimal?
So our focus is an SME fund. We can go down to $3 million. So our ticket size typically between 3 and 8 million. That is difficult for DFI to take that kind of range.
Of course.
So we become that vehicle that can unlock value in African countries.
Hans?
Can I respond to...
Sorry, Hans, can I first give, because he raised his hand, and then I come to you, Rich.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
No, I think the funds are a good channel for sure, but don't forget the banks. In the end, I think the banks are the solution to the mass of SMEs, not the funds. So we need to empower, to support banks to be more active in agri-SME space. For example, we have launched Nazira with an FMO, which is a guarantee program supported by the EC, which allows banks to finance agri SMEs, etc., taking only 5% risk. We take the rest. We also be EC, etc. So we should not forget the banks, because I think there's
What's the cost of that capital, did you say?
Sorry?
What's the cost of that rate? What rate bank charge are you seeing? What rates?
That depends on the bank, etc.
Okay.
But that's
It
should be
that's where it
competitive
fails,
because they're taking it. So
yeah, that's where it fails, because the bank rates are so high that they're basically prohibitive. So businesses can't run effectively on those bank rates. So they rely very heavily. And I do not underestimate the power of DFIs. I'm so grateful to have this many DFIs in this room. Absolutely critical and catalytic. But there is a problem, and the banks are not going to solve it, I don't think, because they're far too expensive for a smaller business. And the DFIs will have to really, really focus on serious fund allocations far more than they are now to get money down to the group that I'm talking about, this SME group.
Thank you, Susan. And we'll come back to that. Richard?
No, I just wanted to respond to Susan's question in terms of what DFI is actually doing in that particular space. I think you should also recognize that the DFI infrastructure architecture is not set up to be able to go down to that level of financing. And if you look at the African Development Bank, we have to balance risk versus, our AAA ratings in terms of what we can actually do within a particular segment. So we try to solve that problem by going through financial intermediaries. So we do about 1.2 billion just financial intermediaries, lines of credits to banks, as Hans mentioned. And we also do a ton of financing also through the private equity funds. At the same time, to acknowledging that gap in terms of financing, we also are setting up various instruments. And I believe my director, Asuko, had mentioned what we are actually doing in terms of trying to put up what we call the Facility for African Agricultural Finance in Africa, FAFINA. We've recognized that trying to address that particular sector, one entity cannot do it alone. You need a platform in which that platform will provide some level of blended finance, and that goes to try to answer your question at what cost can these banks provide that level of capital? So within this particular structure that we are trying to put together, a blended finance structure, it has a first loss structure, it has a subordinated piece, and then we are also working with the DFC to provide a guarantee piece on top of that before the commercial lenders would come in. So from a commercial lending perspective, they are able to throw in additional capital to ensure that that level of capital within which FAFINA would support gets to that bracket that has that huge financing gap.
We talk, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Terry.
I was going to say, we saw this problem where a lot of clients come to us and they have very small ticket requests.
How small? How small is small?
$1 million.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, so see, like we have a portfolio called the Portfolio on Innovation and Impact that is dedicated solely to invest $1 million to $10 million, just that. And that has been one of our most successful initiatives. And we also recognize some clients also want even smaller. So we partnered with the US African Development Foundation, gave them access to line of credit and said, look, give a grant to particular businesses to get them ready. And if they're looking for 100K to 1 million, you can use this facility to lend money to them. So we have that. I think that helps. Do I think that this is a silver bullet? Absolutely not. It cannot be used to sort of solve that financing challenge at scale. But I think just to also, put it out there, that has been one of our most successful and one of our most utilized products, especially in our market, such as here in Africa. Not to say, of course, local financing. It's a big challenge we're really trying to address at the moment. And now we have actually said we can even guarantee a financial institution 100% for one particular client, because we want to take that risk, but because local currency versus FX is such a big problem for them, we will give a guarantee to the bank specifically for that one client. We take all the risk, we just use your channel so they can get local currency.
Otto?
Yeah, maybe alluding to Teddy's example, and also fully understand what you're saying and hear you, Susan. It's an issue with lower ticket sizes needed, and that's simply not an option for us as a DFI. Therefore, we put our money like the Cebu, where Johnny works, And we have also a few other examples in the financial sector where we, for instance, in Uganda have an institution called Agri Finance, providing guarantees for local banks and local MFIs in the agri space so that they can actually provide cheaper loans for the smallholders. So that's the way forward. Started 10 years ago and actually extremely successful on doing so.
We talked about the cost of bank financing, but as a non-banker, sometimes I get this idea that we have anyhow built a very expensive machine, starting from the DFIs, to provide capital. If the DFIs give it to a fund, gives it to another fund, and you add up all these fees and you add up all these costs, you end up with a cost that exceeds almost a bank loan, no? What's about the cost efficiency of this approach? Martin?
We do provide some value add along the way. So I think whilst we do take a fee and there are salaries to be paid, as an investor, a private equity investor, I mean, for Patisa, and I think Zebu is the same, we're very active in our investment approach. We work very closely with the management teams in our companies, and we see how we can support them. So we're not a passive bank that is simply providing debt and then sits back. I mean, it starts with active board participation, governance, ESG, etc., but it goes well beyond that in almost daily interactions with our management teams where we're helping them solve some of the problems. Sometimes we'll just be a sounding board. Sometimes we'll sit down and actually properly have a charter project and do a proper value creation project. We'll deploy some of the technical assistance funds that we talked about. We'll help them with attracting some cheaper bank finance. So for the fee, there's also, I think, quite a lot of value add that we can offer.
Yeah, Johnny?
A gap we saw in the market is actually within trade finance. Now, there are some DFIs that provide that, but that's mainly credit lines to the larger banks, who then needs a team to deploy those funds onto the ground. The challenge in that is that a lot of the value that needs to be unlocked are with the unbanked clients, not the unbankable, because we don't touch those, but the unbanked clients, which are quite small trade companies that, for example, buy cocoa from smallholders in Côte d'Ivoire and sends it across the globe, also Europe, nut farmers in Ghana, sends it across to China, to Vietnam. And we actually invested in a trade finance company to unlock that value. And with $10 million into that company, we actually managed to unlock at least 700 permanent workforce in West Africa. And that's just on a rolling basis.
Which reminds me, if you can think about a brilliant example of how your institution really made a difference in terms of investment, we can come back to that. But let's clarify one thing. Is there, because Martin, you refer to, unfortunately, there's not more capital coming from outside DFI. So is there a lack of capital, or is there a lack of capacity to get rid of the capital? Because I sometimes have the impression there is really enough money, but we can't get rid of it fast enough. Is my perspective wrong? Hans?
Yeah, it is very much to do, I think, with the risk appetite of the DFIs. And we are a regulated bank. We have to abide to certain rules and regulations. So that makes it harder to go to the, let's say, the smaller companies, the more higher risk sectors, etc. And again, that the only way forward there is to be more active user of blended finance. I really believe in that. That if you saw those 4 examples, half of them were possible only because we have blended finance from the Dutch government. And that's, I cannot overstate the importance of that.
Yeah. Anybody wants to say something that we all agree that it's not the availability of capital, but our capacity within a risk framework to disperse it. Is that correct? That's really the challenge.
Not for us. So we could certainly allocate a lot more capital if we had more capital. It's no doubt about it. So I don't see it that way. It might be for others that there are not enough projects or not enough resources to do that allocation, but that is not the issue that we have seen. So if we had more capital, we would allocate more capital.
Teddy?
I mean, my day job is business development. So I get a lot of proposals on a daily, and we could invest in a lot more. So it's not, for us, it's not a lack of it's not a lack of projects, but it's a lack of projects that fit this rigidly defined framework, if that makes sense. And that, especially, I see it with local entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs in sectors that is attract a lot of doers, people who are doing a great job on the ground, but articulating it or putting the business in a way that a DFI would want to participate in is a bit difficult. And so I feel like support in that regard is really helpful to unlock some of those projects.
I was just going to say that there is a waterfall effect with DFIs and DFI money coming into SMEs, and the waterfall effect happens like this. Groups have, our company has a series of agricultural projects on the ground. These are large farms. In one case, we're starting a plant protein business in Mozambique, and these projects impact smallholders greatly. How? Because we end up having a feed-through. We end up being the market. We can do soil analysis. We can give them agronomy. We can give them crop preparation, training. So these whale projects are really vital in terms of supporting the environments in the regions that we operate in. And this is an example of countless other people that do exactly the same thing. But the smallholders also benefit greatly by this feed-through. So even though DFIs aren't allocating to smallholders, the 10 million that they allocate or the 8 million they allocate to companies like ours and others can feed that through. And that's also really important to recognize. And also, just another point, Teddy's example is a really fine one of innovation, because we're a lot of brains in this room, and we have to have action. We have to have accountability, and we have to be able to do something after this conference. And just hearing this now is really heartening, because what it shows is that there are groups that are doing something about this, pushing forward and helping beyond funds, doing projects that work, or doing innovative financing that works for a whole group in this SME sector also.
Yes, Johnny?
Yeah, it's maybe touching upon a little bit of another topic, but I think it's linked to this around the success of different projects and also how we can unlock more value. So there's a tendency of wanting to invest in secondary and tertiary agriculture, but staying away from primary, perceived as higher risk. And also this whole point by the professor from Stellenbosch around closed-end funds. So primary normally does take much longer. But as we heard in the morning, a lot of the value or the opportunities to be pursued in Africa, we do need to invest in primary. So I do think if there's more appetite for primary, you could see more projects come up. And I actually happen to know 2 of the FMO projects because IFU was involved, either as a supplier into it or directly. And the success of those, so they were primary, but they are vertically integrated. And in our fund, we have a pig farm in Cameroon and a chicken farm here in South Africa. And the success of those are also because we are fully vertically integrated. So there is an opportunity to take risk in the primary as long as it's being managed smart.
We talked about the ticket size, but we also heard from some speakers that the challenge in agriculture is that you can't take just one component of the value chain because everything has to work. It almost calls for a bigger ticket size, like an actor who commits to the whole value chain, not only that small part. Is that not a role where DFI should be much more aggressive in daring to commit to a full value chain rather than in bits and pieces? Because they probably are the only one who have the leverage to do that. Any thoughts on that? Teddy?
I think that's important because many businesses, especially startups, usually would approach a farmer and would want to solve one problem instead of the entirety of the farmer's needs. From my perspective, I think farmers need just 4 things. It's inputs, it's access to finance, so quality inputs, access to finance to be able to afford those inputs. It's a technical know-how to know how to grow, when to tend for it, etc., and access to markets. And if any one of this is not working, then it doesn't matter. The investment will just not be able to return the returns that you expect. Now, many startups you'd see would be coming and they would say, we are offering efficient inputs, or like we're improving the efficiency of the inputs. Or some would say we are improving access to market. Or some would say we are financing the smallholder farmer. But everybody is trying to maximize on the profit for whatever they're doing. So at the end of the day, this unit called a farmer is not profitable. That's why I like businesses like, one that is highlighted here, Bangona, is great because it approaches the farmer as a business unit, and they provide everything that they need for them to be successful. The problem with that is usually for those businesses to be successful, it requires a lot of capital. And sometimes a startup can bite a lot more than it can chew. I saw this because I was working on a similar business in Nairobi. And in Nairobi, there's a lot of those startups that are providing specific things, finance, inputs, markets, etc. And there was one startup that was doing, it all. And I visited the farmers, in different areas, and I'd never seen as much dedication or joy, really, from the farmers' perspective. However, that business folded because they just could not raise money enough. They could not raise money on time, and COVID was just coming in. It was one of the most sad things for me to see. This time was my previous job, but I totally believe that the piecemeal approach that we that we are embodying right now in approaching farmers is just makes it even more unsustainable financially. We need the collective approach so that you charge a small margin on everything, but overall, it makes sense financially.
Thank you. Hans, yeah?
I think it's, integration was mentioned, and I think that's critical to the success of the companies that we finance. In the volatile enabling environment, you need to control your critical stages in the value chain. Point is that doesn't go well together with SME finance, because SMEs are too vulnerable to play this integration game, right? Because as you say, you need capital. So what we do try to achieve is through our integrated clients to support farmers, to support the smallholders. I think that's probably the most successful way so far to support cooperatives, farmers. And you can stimulate that by capacity development, even by price differentiation to give certain incentives. I think that's a very potent way to play and to support SMEs.
You refer to capacity development as being a very important part of investees. That is a really big challenge. How can we on the receiving end? Can you say something about what your institutions do about pushing that? And Joe, I think you had a good example about that.
Yeah, I think actually the challenge is on finding money, but the money will come if we can back organizations that have the human capacity to deliver on their projects. And often the difficulty in Africa is to find those organizations that are able to deliver. Hence, one of the answers to that conundrum is for a few DFIs, including my own, to help increase the capacity of our sponsors. So one example is a company that is leader in its market in West Africa. It owns 80% of the market of an horticulture commodity. So the access to market is not an issue. Unfortunately, they want to vertically integrate, but they never, although it's a very solid, financially healthy group, they don't have experience in primary agriculture. What we did is we validated the case for vertically integrated. It economically made sense to grow that horticulture commodity in country. Then after that, we are bringing to them the capacity that they need. We found an expert that had both primary agriculture, running a very large-scale farm in that commodity in Europe that happened to have semi-retired in Africa, so knew the African context and had the credential to run large-scale commercial organization. And that person, we brought him on board. We are paying for it. He's in effect running the establishment of the farm for the first few years, starting by a pilot. We also bring on board environment and social capacity, which is one of the big risks, managing the relationship with the community. It's often a big risk in primary agriculture. We also bringing on board that capacity and paying for it. And together with a sponsor and that capacity building, we hope in due course, after a few years, to have a team that is able to fend for themselves and prove with a small pilot that they can deliver on a fraction of the ultimate project, which is to make the country self-sufficient in that commodity. So it's a very, ambitious project.
Andreas?
Yeah, I think what Sean is saying is important. It's competence. And we have invested in primary agriculture in Africa for 20 years without succeeding. It has been extremely difficult. And we acknowledge that we are not farmers, we are not agronomists, we are not the ones who can step in and change things when it's difficult. So that is one reason why we have outsourced part of those investments to professionals at that, like Agdevco, who is in the room and will be speaking tomorrow. They are a professional team doing it every day and on the ground and can step in and help the projects when they are in difficulties. We didn't have that capacity, we didn't have the competence. As such, the results are not fantastic. So it's about building competence, both for the investors, but also on the ground for the farmers. And one area where we can do that, which is within farming, that's fisheries and aquaculture. There we have the competence, we have the expertise that we can take from Norway and introduce to the projects. So there we can be a direct and good investor over time. But within primary agriculture, we saw that we have paid our school fees there now. We need some experts to help us with it.
Yeah. Richard?
Yeah, I think throughout this discussion, we've spoken more to the funding aspect in terms of, we've not touched on the other side. That means the project sponsor who is actually coming to the DFIs to actually look for funding. I think one critical area is the readiness of the projects that are presented and how the projects are actually packaged to really accept DFI sort of funding. You realize that, you receive so many proposals in a week or in a year. So the key to really, quickly selecting a project which would be ready for DFI funding is how ready that project is. And that also tends to the fact that, most of the projects that come through probably are looking for capital versus, coming in through, see if there's a key way for technical assistance, which could lead into packaging the project in a way that would be ready for DFI packaging. And I think IFC does it better. You've just developed a huge upstream infrastructure, which works with, project sponsors over 2 to 3 years and get them ready before the origination team takes over from that particular perspective. So I think that's one key area that project sponsors would also need to focus on if they are to attract funding.
Thank you, Richard. If there's anybody from the audience who would like to raise a question, feel free. You just raise your hand and somebody will hand you a mic. In the meantime, we just continue our conversation, but feel free. In the earlier speakers have made reference to the traditional model in terms of the traditional private equity model not being so suited, 2%, time horizon of between 5 and 10%, not maybe being ideally suited. There has been some talk in the DFI world also about other parameters to measure fund performance, like impact instead of just return on capital. Is anything happening from where you sit? Is anything happening in that area? Is there changes coming?
Maybe me to give a few words on that. We have just are underway signing a agreement with a fund manager on, let's say, they are getting their fees, but part of it is measured on their impact, on what kind of CO2 reductions they can do. It's in the agri space, so there's a clear definition, eligibility criteria on what to be met over the next coming years, over the 10-year period actually. So, and then in year 10, they are paid to certain thresholds that they have shown that they have reduced CO2 emission with XX million tons of CO2. So it's coming, I believe. So we have seen the first funds marketing that. So, and we do a limited, let's say, fund exposure. We have a limited fund exposure. So for this one, we would like to do.
Susan?
I guess the question is really, are funds the favored destination, when allocating money by a DFI. And it seems to me, and I could be wrong, that that is correct, that funds are the favored destination. And I have generally avoided funds because of the fee drag. And so I haven't particularly liked to have them in terms of the vehicle to use, which is why I've got a permanent capital vehicle for these projects. However, in an effort to secure this funding, I'm the co-founder of a fund that is launching now, which is a gender lens fund that is investing across all sectors in Africa called GLIDE, Gender Lens Investing and Disadvantaged Entrepreneurs Fund. And this fund is being put together so that we can secure DFI money through 2X Challenge and through other means so that we can service this sector that I refer to that requires funding at a basic level of $5 million approximately. Because what I see now is bootstrapping. And because companies like mine and others don't want to go to a bank and borrow at 15 or 12%, they bootstrap. And it means that their expansion is much slower and more gradual. So I guess the question really is, will DFIs, and I understand completely, I'm a lawyer, I understand completely the structure that's necessary for an investment. I completely understand that. But the question is, will DFIs move to another means of investment, of deployment, beyond funds? Or do you think you're going to stay largely in the fund arena, which I'm going to join now, in order to deploy that capital?
Hans?
It's an interesting point. I think there's a difference between debt and equity there. I think in debt, there's a clear preference to have direct investments, to see the direct impact. In funds, I recognize a bit there's a cultural difference because equity investors find it still a bit scary, agriculture, right? Also within our bank. So they like to tag along with funds in co-investments. It's changing now. But it's only changing because we got some cross-fertilization from the Agri group with some people going to equity with better understanding. And once people have a better understanding of agribusiness, food and agribusiness, they also have more confidence to invest directly. So it's really about knowledge, I think, in the end.
And the future looks better.
But there's the rub. I mean, there's the rub. And because what we've gained here and what we've understood, and this is absolutely true, is that primary production is risky. It's at the coalface. It's heavy lifting. And who is going to fund that? I'm there. I mean, I understand it because our company is there at the coalface. And getting funding for that is even hard to secure from banks on the ground. Why? Because we're not low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit are mining companies and easier targets. Agricultural companies are too risky. So you can't really secure that money very easily, even from banks, even if you're prepared to do this at 12 to 15, and in the case of Mozambique, 19%.
Martin?
I just want to pick up on that point, and I guess, I mean, as an example, I'm using a business that we're invested in Sierra Leone. It's a palm oil business. And I look at, and back to your point on integration, Frank, so this is a business that relies heavily on outgrowers to collect fruit. Our company then effectively does the processing, the milling and creating palm oil out of the fruits, with then a route to market business that sells, in this case, organic palm oil to mostly Northern Hemisphere markets. At each stage of that value chain, there's different financing needs. And again, at the smallholder level in our outgrower scheme, the technical assistance is absolutely key. And that's effectively donor money, if you want to call it that. But it's starting up an outgrower scheme of scale. At the milling, at the processing stage, it was our equity that came in that resurrected a derelict mill. And that got the whole process starting. And now that we've got an effective route to market into the Northern Hemisphere, that business needs debt, and that can be very well commercial debt or DFI debt or one of those specialist investors that Andreas was talking about. So at different stages of the integration, it requires different types of funding. And the DFIs, the TA providers all play a role in that, I think.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? If not, I'm slowly...
There is a question.
Oh, there is a question there. Is your mic on?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, go ahead, yeah.
I just have one question. When we look at the DFIs, it's something that I hear before, and also from earlier today, the conversation is almost similar. We have a framework. we have a structure, sometimes a little bit difficult for the ordinary investor for the ordinary entrepreneur to get access to. The question is, when those frameworks were originally there, did not take into account the focus on the African agriculture the way it is today. And we talk about developing African agriculture, being available, being there. What is it that will specifically happen to address the situation? Because the smallholder farmers are there. We're trying to aggregate them. We're trying to make them fit into a particular box. Maybe the question does not have an answer today. It's homework that we should take. This is the situation today. If we're to make a change where we don't have to force the other side, where we say we're supporting the smallholder, we're supporting the SMEs, we're supporting all of those small pillars that will enable Africa. What is it that we can do differently as organizations to meet those at the point of where they're at, rather than trying to make them, because they're talking about lack of capacity. And by default, the way things are structured, they're forcing the middleman. They're forcing so many layers. So it's set in a way that is already so costly for a basic small organization or basic individuals to get into the system. Maybe that's how we should, for me, that's the challenge that I have myself. What can we do differently, not to make the people fit into the existing structures, but what is it that we can do differently just so that we can meet the situation the way it is today? That is the question I have, so that we don't just focus on the challenges, we don't focus on what makes it difficult, but we focus on something we've not thought of before, something that does not exist, because we cannot have a meeting after meeting after meeting, same organization, talking about that. We've already seen a lot of beautiful success stories that are coming through, but it's like one organization is pulling on its own, and it becomes very difficult to go. But if many of the old structures could already start thinking of completely different ways, we have many people now doing transactions at the very rural area just using their phone when they don't even have access to a branch, a bank. Was not the case before. A different thought came through with technology. Maybe those are the kind of questions that we should start asking ourselves, not what exists, not what makes it difficult, but what is it that we can do differently? Because we're sitting here, the people we're talking about are not even here. They don't even know we're talking about them. It's just a question. For me, it's a personal challenge, and it's a challenge that I'm sharing with everybody else, and I'm praying that we have some answers sometime. Thank you.
Any response, or would you have any to the person asking the question? Are you thinking of anything specific that DFIs or private sector could do better or differently to address that? Exactly that point that we have been debating as well.
Obviously, I have expertise in a particular area. So in an area where I'm at, it's like how to show up at the ground where the farmers and try to do something different. I'm not an expert in finance. I'm not an expert in funding. That's why I'm asking. Maybe those are the kind of things. In the area where I've been operating, we had to look at changing business models, because the business models that have been used for large-scale, big farms, they, in as much as in theory might work, but the assumption that we make at an individual level, the capacity to get into that framework. So it's actually go down to that level and say, what is the gap? Because, you know, everybody operates in this framework, but there's a lot of people that are sitting outside of the gap. So what is that gap? So how do we close that gap? Not to try to make the people fit here, but how do we look at the opportunity within this gap and then move with that? I'm not a funding expert, I'm not a finance expert, so I cannot give an example, but in the area where I'm at is go out of the framework, go to where people are left out that are not even able to get, it's like get to a point where we have inclusivity, because right now there's a lot of people that are excluded from the main frame, like the main value chain.
And I think that's why that Susan referred to, but also Johnny is active, and maybe Johnny, you can respond to that.
Yeah, I'm brave enough to give that a stab. So I agree with you. It requires a different way of thinking. and if I can put it simply, to take risk out of the value chain. If we can do that, then it becomes easier to finance. It becomes easier to get input, be insurance, finance, or the input you need to buy. I gave the example of the trade finance company before, where we're helping smallholder farmers. Another example is an agtech company we invested in, where we have a very good partnership with large-scale farmers or off-takers, cooperatives. And in order to increase their yield, they want to work with smallholder farmers. The problem with that is a lot of it is not documented. They don't know how much yield they're going to get out. So we're helping them map these different smallholder farmers and predict their yield output. And that allows the bigger companies, the off-takers, to plan their production. At least in South Africa, I don't know about the rest of the continent, there are some governmental grants for smallholders. And by mapping these smallholder farmers, putting them on a database, we're also allowing grants to go to these smallholder farmers to buy input, but not to get the grants in form of cash, but actually to become a virtual cooperative and buy the seeds, the fertilizer, what else the smallholder farmers need. So in a way, we're creating cooperatives and we're taking out risk of the market. It was just one example. I think your question is very diverse, so happy to hand
Hans?
over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we yesterday had a discussion on black economic empowerment in South Africa with a couple of people, experts, and I think South Africa can be a model, an example also for other countries in terms of innovation and innovativity on integration of smallholders and of emerging farmers in various models. So I think that's important to look at. At the same time, we also should realize that not all smallholders, I think, can, let's say, turn into emerging or commercial farmers. So capacity development is very important, but in the end, selection, that was one of the lessons learned of yesterday's discussion, is also important. And then, of course, I think the government has a role to play in providing the right support policies, agricultural policies to develop the segments and the rural framework.
I first want to have a look at the audience if there's another question.
I just wanted to contribute in terms of that. I think
Richard, yeah, go ahead.
if you look at the African Development Bank, and I'm speaking more from the team that does the sovereign operations. I sit on non-sovereign operations. There are various flagship programs that go to address exactly what my sister has asked. If you look at what we call the TAT program, Technologies for African Agriculture Transformation, where we're trying to introduce technology into agricultural practices. It's such a good program where improved seeds are produced to ensure these technologies are adopted by farmers. You look at what Atsuko just spoke about in terms of the special agro processing zones, where we are developing infrastructure in various areas to put in the relative infrastructure to ensure that farmers and various organizations have the inbuilt infrastructure to establish and be able to be productive in those sectors. So I think there are so many sort of flagship initiatives that are going on that goes to address some of the points that she raised.
Let me first go to the question.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Try to frame it as a question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My name is Lalamba Piri. I'm very much interested in hearing about what the DFIs are doing about starting to look at investing with a gender lens. After all, our continent has got more women getting into entrepreneurship than men. And this panel is very telling because ultimately, like invests in like. And I would like to know if if funds are the preferred route for investing. We're still seeing very dismal investment going into female-led fund managers. And so what are you doing about it? We're leaving behind 50% of the continent by not investing in women. We're losing $90 billion of productivity a year by not doing that right. And we're seeing this reflected not just at fund level, but also at entrepreneurship level. So what are you doing about it?
Anybody has a comment to that? Or do you accept responsibility? Because you could say that is actually not the DFI's challenge, but that is on the other side of the fence. How can we have more women entrepreneurs needing capital?
Just a quick comment from my side. We actually live it. So the partners in our fund, half of them are women. The staff, half of them are women, both on management and middle management level. And by the way, I only produce girls. So we live it.
Anybody else? Specific programs to push this point?
Not really, I would say. When we are hiring people at our side, we are very much looking to get some females employed, but they are lacking in our, let's say, investment sphere. So 1 out of 10, that's what it is, unfortunately. So how could we do better on that? Maybe on the, let's say, education level, I don't know. But it seems like the interest is lacking when we are advertising for let's say, a new hire.
Susan?
1 out of 10.
Susan, before I go to Martin, because what do you think? Is it culture? Is it, where's the problem?
The problem is just the disconnect between finding the talent, and this is the issue, because there is masses of talent. There are so many women, not only in agriculture, but in finance and elsewhere, and I'm sensitive to what you said. I'm sure that what you're saying is accurate. But the fact is that I think we talk about women's empowerment, and the word empowerment is an interesting one, because I think women's empowerment, I think the word empowerment is actually misused. I think women are empowered. They're empowered already. Give us funding and get out of our way, basically, is the way that women look at this now. It's more fund us and let us go forward. And it's not actually about, there is a huge swathe of women that are very highly educated, that are very competent, and all the statistics that I won't repeat now show that when there is gender equality, businesses do better. So are you sensitive when you make an investment that there are women on the board, that there are women at senior levels, that there are women coming through the ranks? Because I am, and it matters. So it matters that everyone on this panel, and actually there were some very, very good women speakers that were DFI representatives earlier, so I understand this. And we don't just have to have, I can understand the mix on this panel to a degree. But the fact is that there have to be more women at the table. And there've got to be more women in management. And because of that, there has to be a very aggressive stance taken to 2X Challenge and other initiatives within all of your organizations that promote women. It's as simple as that. And 2X Challenge, as good as it is, and it's a fantastic initiative, has focused largely to date on Latin America, less on Africa. 11.4 billion between 2018 and 2020. 4 billion went into Latin America, 3 billion went into Africa, and then the rest of the world. Now there's 15 billion that should be deployed over the next year or within this time frame between 2020 and 2022. The problem that many women on the ground here face is that they don't see that because the investment criteria are so strict that they don't receive that. So for example, when I decided to launch Glide, I called a series of DFIs and spoke to them, and I know many of these women already. And they were dealing with their investment criteria, but at the time I was told, this is a year ago, that when I had $100 million under management, I should come back to them. Now, that simply doesn't work, and that's why the criteria is changing. This is fluid, but we have to get real, and we have to get very real about how we're going to start deploying money through to help women-owned and women-managed businesses.
Martin?
I'll keep it brief. So like Johnny mentioned for Zebu, I think we have a mix of men and women at Partisa, and also the men have really subscribed to, I think, the intent here, and we've signed up to the 2X Challenge. As Partisa, we qualify, and our goal is for every one of our investee companies to qualify in terms of the 2X Challenge. And even if we're investing in a business that doesn't have that gender equality yet, that's the opportunity. And I think Susan's exactly right. It starts with board representation, senior management. We make sure that from smallholders are great examples where there are many women smallholders out there, special support for them. So there are many initiatives that we can take where businesses today very often are still quite male in the environment that we invest in. And what can our contribution be to help change that and to get more gender equality in, starting with gender policies and all the basic things that one needs to do to make it a more inclusive business. And to Susan's point, I think the data supports that more diverse businesses are better performing businesses. There's a clear business rationale for this.
And to be fair on the organizers, yesterday, and Susan was there was an afternoon session on women in agriculture and women in business. So I think there is a growing awareness on the importance of the topic. I would like to draw it to a close with a final question for each of you in whatever order you want. And I want you to ask the question, are we on track actually in terms of agriculture? Super important for Africa development. If we don't crack agriculture, Africa has at best an average, if not a bleak future, right? We talk and talk about, we have these conferences, but what do you say? Don't worry, we are on track, we are churning along, it's in the right direction? Or is it, no, we are not on track? Unless we find a way of changing the trajectory, either to aggressive government intervention, maybe we have to be less macho in terms of we can save Africa and we can't do it without more government accountability, or maybe we need more money, or maybe we need another model, I don't know. But my question to you is, are we on the right trajectory or are we not? And I take it that you don't necessarily have the answer to what's the solution. Who wants to take this first?
I will. Okay, we're not on track. We're not on track, and the reason we're not on track is simply because there is this underserved community. However, having said all of that, without DFIs, let's face it, realistically, without DFIs, Africa would stumble, because DFI money and DFI support is absolutely catalytic, and I don't mean to overuse that word. It is absolutely vital. Why? Because governments are not active enough on the ground in terms of supporting the sector, either financially or through various reducing the bureaucracy on a day-to-day basis. So I think the governments on the ground have to step up, create more SEZs, create more zones that are going to enable businesses. On the other hand, DFIs, I think, have to get more innovative about how they serve the SME community and how they serve more than the larger funds or the funds as they do today. So with innovation, yes, it will get on track, but it's not on track yet.
Thank you, Susan. Richard? Let's keep it succinct.
Very succinct. I think from the African development perspective, we are definitely on track. We launched our Feed Africa program 2015, 2016, when our president came in as one of our strategic imperatives to be able to deploy over a period of time about 10 billion in the ag space. And without the impact of COVID, I think we would be doing about 2 billion a year in total, not just from a private sector perspective, but from a total ag investment perspective. So I think, we're definitely on track. We definitely have flagship programs which are definitely showing a lot of impact in the ag sector. So I think definitely we are on track, but of course the financing gap still remains, and it's a gap that we all need to close.
Thank you, Richard. Otto?
Very brief. When we are voting here, I believe we do. Are we on track or not on track? I believe we are doing our best, but we are not on track, unfortunately. And the time coming up with the Ukraine issue, war, whatever, FMO Petinel mentioned 80 billion a year imported. That was the same amount I heard 10 years ago. So not much has happened. Of course, many more people in Africa, but on the other hand, yeah, we are not on track.
Thank you.
What Otto and Susan said.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Agree with Susan and Otto.
Jean? We're not, or you refuse to answer?
No, I think I would phrase the question differently, which is, are we progressing fast enough? I think the continent is progressing, fortunately, but will we be able to deliver fast enough for the bulge of population that is coming? That's a real question.
Yeah.
What Otto said, if there is the same amount of import on the continent is true as of 10 to 20 years ago, it's a good sign, because the population has grown very fast and has grown also richer. So we'd expect, anything being equal, that imports would be higher today. But ideally, there shouldn't be that much import. It should be self-sufficiency. at least in the core commodities, which is not the case.
Thank you, Jean. Hans?
We are on track, but the track has to be widened. It's too narrow. So I think where we now focus on bankable projects, bankable clients, I think the trend, and we are part of that, is to go to pre-bankability, to invest knowledge, technical assistance, whatever we have, through partnerships in improving bankability of agri SMEs, help them in this very difficult transformation to corporates. So I think that's what we will focus on. We call it market creation, by the way.
Teddy?
Yeah, I think, like Otto said, we're trying. And also, I think Andreas had mentioned something to do with the capacity. It's important. In the DFC, we hired food security, for example, is one of the teams that has is one of the only sectors that has a dedicated team for us. And we hired a gentleman from AgDevCo, and joined us in 2020. Since then, we've seen quite a large improvement in our portfolio in that sector. I think in 2020 was, say, 165 million. 2021 was about 330, and last year, the year ended September 2022, it was about 630 million just in terms of ag commitments. And it is with this capacity where we have seen more bold bets, small tickets, 3.75 in Chikoa Fish Farm just closed. Those are great deals that it'd be difficult for DFI to do nonetheless. That being said, I think we are not on track. We're not on track as far as investing in agriculture is concerned, because for as long as a majority of the population depend on agri, but for as long as 70% of Africa's poor is still people in agri, we're nowhere near on track. We're nowhere near on track if our produce are fetching lower prices abroad, or we're losing more than 50% of our produce after harvest. We're not on track in that regard, right? So a lot needs to be done, and this agri is not a sector where agri, just like health and many other sectors, is a sector where delays means, losses of livelihoods. We should not be dying of hunger in Africa right now, and see what's happening. So it's really urgent. It's important. We need to move fast enough. And that's the question again: are we moving fast enough? No. So I think we can definitely do better. And finally, I think I want to mention, as far as diversity is concerned, Susan, I really empathize with the challenges you're facing with fundraising, and now you have to tweak your model to fit the 10-year life kind of thing. Now imagine if you're a local woman, trying to face the same issues.
Yep.
So we also need to think about diversity as far as local talent is concerned. People who have lived this experience, people who know, the risks, in a more in-depth way, because that also helps in terms of the outcomes of our investment. And this is not just having an analyst who is a local. It's having people in key decision-making positions where they're able to influence, the investments that are being made by the different organizations.
Martin?
I can't disagree with anything that's been said before, but maybe just a general comment, on track, off track. Africa is not one country, and I guess there are some countries that are the darlings of the investors, and some countries that are not. And I think there's probably a difference in terms of on track, off track by country that one could establish as well.
Johnny?
I've been around long enough to remember the Lions on the Move and lots of other positive things. I got excited this morning about the opportunities. Whether we're on track, I'm not exactly sure, but there's too many obstacles in the road to allow us to move fast enough. So personally, I agree that I don't think we are on track because of all the challenges that Africa is facing. A lot of it is self-inflicted. If I want to keep my positive attitude, the failure of the rest of the world with COVID, logistical challenges, the war in Ukraine could actually be the saving grace that Africans need to sort out. We need to sort out the problems on the continent, create the value chains that supplies the economies.
Thank you. I would like to thank the whole panel. As a moderator, I'm not entitled to my own opinion, but I'm going to give it anyhow. As you can imagine from my line of questioning, I think that we are not on track. I think Africa is in need of a deep sense of urgency. I really think that the DFIs do everything possible and have played a tremendous role, but that they should now much more leverage that role in an accountability sense. Nothing can be dramatically changed if we don't hold governments accountable, call for stronger regulatory environments, and the DFIs have leverage We know all about the past of this continent, and people feel uneasy about calling this out. But I think it's now a matter of life and death, of really starting to call out governments on doing their part of the equation. So that's my bit in this. I thank you very much. I thank the audience. And over for the... Thank you. Thanks very much. So I would like to call Alex to the stage. Where's Alex? Because Alex is going to moderate the next panel. It is actually heavy on the legs, I must say. So be warned. So I'll let you introduce the next panel, and then at the end I'll come back, okay? Let me help you with this.
Thank you, Martin. Oops. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Thank you, Frank. Oh, thanks. And thank you for the fascinating discussion. Well, I hope you still have a bit of energy. But that almost looked like a family meeting at some point with cousins agreeing, disagreeing, exchanging views. So you set the bar very high. Let me call my fellow panelists. Can you please come to the panel? We have Kegampi, Claire, Roman, Anne, Ruggero, Johanna, and Atsuko. So we have more panels than table, but sharing is caring. So. Good. Well, I'd like to start to thank Frank and the previous panelists. I had prepared a nice intro, but after such a session, I think we don't need an intro. We can go and jump directly into the meat of the subject, which is how can DFIs do more and better in the agri-food sector. So the previous session was more of a state of play, where we are today in terms of DFIs in agribusiness. Now we're going to look at the future. Let's move forward and see what can be done, be creative, imaginative, what can be done to do more. And I'll let all the panelists introduce themselves. Please tell your name, your organization, but also where do you sit in this agri-food finance universe. Maybe we start with Johanna at the left. Thank you.
So good afternoon. Johanna Raihalme is my name, and I head FinFund's Nairobi office, so focusing on East Africa investments. FinFund, as you may guess from the name, is the Finnish DFI. We are a slightly smaller DFI. We have a portfolio of about 1 billion, and we invest about 250 million annually across markets, across industries, but Africa and agribusiness are one of the focus areas. We invest in both debt and equity, and with ticket sizes ranging from, on average, from 5 to 15 million.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Good to be back and to have the Agri Indaba in person again. Anne Kepler, I'm DEG's Regional Director for Southern Africa, so certainly a bit on the home turf here, but we obviously look at a Pan-African portfolio of 2.5 billion invested across the continent, also with an agri component, although not as strong as we would all hope to be speaking at the Agri Indaba. But the one comment I need to make at the beginning, if we are looking more at the future, we definitely have a much higher female representation in the future than we had on the past just now.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you, Anne. Kegampi?
Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Khampi Babela. I'm heading the agro-processing and agriculture at the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa. It's one, I think, of the older DFIs. We just turned 82 last month. Agriculture is not one of our largest sector. We dominating, our exposure is dominated by mining as well as energy and infrastructure with around $5 billion US dollars. But the agri portfolio is fairly smaller, but we are very active in the space. We've been playing the space for a few decades now. We fund from greenfields to expansions, both in long-term crops that mostly have export potential, but as well as agro-processing. In terms of funding women, we do fund businesses that are women-owned, but where we do not have reach, we actually, so far, we're investing in 2 funds that are managed, led by women, and funding only women-based projects. Thanks.
Thank you. Roman?
Hi, Roman Frankel. I head direct equity food and agriculture investments at BI, British International Investment. It's great to be here, many familiar faces, and in fact I spent 2 years with Frank on the board. We have a portfolio of over $500 million in food and agriculture across equity, debt, fund of funds, and trade finance, and we've been present in this space for quite some time, and it's an important sector for us.
Thank you for being here. Claire?
Hello everyone, so I'm Claire, I'm in charge of the Agri team of Proparco. So Proparco is the subsidiary of the French Agency for Development. Proparco is on its way to commit 2.5 billion euros per year, globally speaking, and when it comes to agro, Proparco has committed over the past 10 years some 1.6 billion to agro sector, both direct and indirect investments, and more than half of this is dedicated to Africa. So the sector remains key for Proparco, despite the challenges, and we've discussed the challenges in the previous panel. We remain committed and definitely willing to be closer to the market and better understand those challenges, to be able to have our offering evolve and get more adapted to those challenges today.
Thank you, Claire. Ruggero?
Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, thank you to the organizer and to FAO for having invited us to this roundtable. It's also the first time that we join this conference, so we are really pleased to be here. I'm Ruggero Pietrafesa, and within the Development Finance Unit of Cassa Depositi and Prestiti, which is the Italian DFI, I'm responsible for manufacturing, agribusiness and services, as well as financial institutions. CDP, the development finance activity have started only 2018, so we are really building up our exposure to the sector, and we want to improve our knowledge of the market, of the African region, and also, of course, strengthen our relationships with stakeholders, DFIs, and the MDBs that are here. So really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruggero. And Atsuko, well, I don't think you need an intro anymore. Everybody knows you, but please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Atsuko Toda. I'm the Director for Ag Finance and Rural Infrastructure Development. As Richard mentioned in the previous, we do debt, equity, and guarantees all over Africa. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you to all the panelists for being here. Let me just remind you the rules of the game. The idea is to have a discussion which is as interactive, informal as possible. So I'll ask direct questions to each of you, but don't hesitate to interrupt each other, jump in, say when you agree or disagree. We really want to have a lively conversation. And to make that lively, let's maybe start by answering one of the recurring comments that were made in the previous session, where I think it was Suzanne who a few times kind of complained about DFIs not doing enough to support SMEs. And I think at some point also someone mentioned the fact that it's difficult for DFI to do primary agriculture. That's something we very often hear, that DFIs are just not designed to work with PMEs, with SMEs, or to finance primary agriculture. But here we have a DFI, FinFund, which actually does a lot with SMEs and does finance primary agriculture. So, Johanna, what's your secret?
Thank you. I don't think there is a secret as such. I think maybe it just takes a bit of courage sometimes. So as a smaller DFI, we do have the advantage of being able to deploy smaller ticket sizes, and also we do invest in direct equity, which helps. But we're not even talking about the very early stage ventures here, but we're talking about companies or investments in the ticket size range of 4 to 8 million, where we see a lot of very innovative, fast-growing companies that still find it hard to access financing from the markets or from other DFIs. But in fact, I think that's a very natural space for a DFI to play, acting as a catalyst finance. But of course, it's quite risky, and company selection is key. So these are often younger companies, so they're founder-led. So we spend a lot of time with the entrepreneurs trying to understand not only their capability to execute the business plans, but also to pivot from the original plans if things don't go as planned. And financing the right business plans is very crucial, because also we can't be just pouring capital blindly into the sector, because we would be distorting the market. So we just spend a lot of time with the teams and understanding their capabilities. And sometimes it just takes that leap of faith. Because also we as DFIs, we like to follow each other. So when there is one DFI in a deal, others will follow. But then it takes a lot of courage to be that first one.
Thank you. So when there is a will, there is a way, but you need faith, courage, and resources, of course. Maybe also to comment on the many discussions we heard this morning on the impact of the war in Ukraine, and especially in food importing countries. Atsuko, to go to the other end of the table, what's your view on what DFI can do about that? How can DFIs really help to unleash the potential of food and agriculture in Africa?
Thank you so much, Alex, for that question. If I may, just because one of the things that we'd really like to come out of this platform is really for us to work together. I mean, I'd really like to build on what my colleague from FinFund said. Like, as DFIs, what you see before you is different risk appetites, but also different capacities in terms of financial product, and also different ticket sizes, as you mentioned. So if she can do the 4 to 8 million, we can do the 10 to 20 million. And it's really important to have that trajectory in terms of growth for companies, and then also the combination of DFIs that can do equity, and if there is a company that needs to strengthen the equity pillar, but we'd really like to do the senior debt, like coming in together. So I really think that as a universe, we can really work together. Just going back to your question, Alex, about how we can unleash the food potential of African countries, one of the things that came out in the other conversation is the importance of supporting what can be import substituted. Right now in Africa, we have an issue of this staple import. Well, one of the things we need to do is focus on particular regional value chains, and then getting government commitment at the highest political level to say, this is now the time for us to bring the public-private sector and finance some of those staples. And I think there is no better time than now than getting that political commitment, and then we, as a private sector platform at Agri Indaba, to support that public sector high-level commitment to be able to deliver. And so I think, working with the FAO Investment Center, as EBRD has done in Eastern Europe, is a great example of what we need to do in Africa, and focus on some commodities to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Atsuko. And please don't be shy, otherwise I'll just ask questions. But yeah.
Maybe I should comment on the same question. I think it's not only going to be the agriculture sector itself, but it also has to take the state. There has to be collaboration. I'll give an example with South Africa and what we're doing as the IDC. with we over the years, as a country, we always had a deficit, especially in the poultry value chain, where we're producing around 1.7 million tons, but we're consuming around 2.2 million. So what it meant is it means we end up having to import. But now with the current crisis, obviously, price is also going up. So, but that just found us also on the way. Government with the industry then came up with a plan, a master plan, where a decision was made that we're going to have to upscale some of the small farmers and make sure that they operate at commercial scale. But also private sector had to undertake to increase their own capacity. And I mean, just in the past 18 months alone, as the IDC, we've been able to contribute towards 17% of what is currently imported on annual basis in terms of funding from or increasing capacity of the broiler farmers, but as well as in introducing new capacity on the secondary and tertiary side. So it has to be a coordinated effort.
Yeah, that's okay.
Can I just build on that for my colleague from IDC? I think one of the things that we're not doing very well is, for example, taking the investments that we make and linking that to policy as a DFI community. Because, you know, we saw some of the commitments that FMO has made, for example, Babangona and Niche. These are in particular sectors where these companies need policy and enabling business environment. Well, as DFIs, we should be the channel to help the companies where not only we've invested, but their challenges to go to scale. Because if we're talking about transformation, we want the companies in this room to be able to go to scale, but you can't do that without the right policy environment. And DFIs, we have actually not only a responsibility to finance, but also to channel that message to governments.
Thank you. Well, it looks like cooperation and joining force together is already one way to do more and do better. And do you have any views maybe on why this is not happening enough, this cooperation?
I think the cooperation is actually happening, and I think the key is complementarity here and diversification. You also don't want to have 10 competitors in your one space growing, for the example earlier, blueberries in the same region. You actually want to have diversification, you want to have key, and you want one provider who actually has a solution for you. And I think that's where I think the matchmaking and the navigation between the different DFIs is key to give a bit more guidance to say, okay, who can do straight equity, which are maybe private equity funds on an indirect basis who can help and add the value. We had Zebu and Johnny for Zebu and Martin for Fatiza on the panel earlier. But then also, where are maybe the larger tickets? Where's different supports? Where's access to blended finance? Where's more business support service and technical assistance for businesses? Because not every challenge has the same solution. So I think there we really need to assist and to just encourage that they talk to us, especially the representatives on the ground, to say who would be the right counterpart and to make referrals. And I think we've got a good track record also between the joint office between FMO and DG, where certain deals we couldn't do, but the other one could. And I think those are positive examples on how the value chain of food chain, for the lack of a better explanation on that, actually works, to really say, okay, we don't all need to provide the same solution, but one of us has. And that's, for me, the most important point.
That's a very good point. And actually, we often do talk about DFIs as one big collective, but actually, maybe we should talk more about the differences among various DFIs to allow companies to more effectively target their financing requests, and we would get better quality leads, which would probably take away also some of the frustration around the big rejection rate of proposals from DFIs.
I think maybe on the business model, Andreas mentioned AgDevco. You know, we as BII has co-funded AgDevco with Norfund and DFC, and I think one has to think of management teams, maybe, because the reason that we as investor community, and I'll drop maybe the word DFI, struggle with small enterprises is depth of management and maybe management's ability to actually handle our processes. Let's face it, our processes are quite rigorous. So finding avenues to actually be able to work with the management teams who can take our money and who can be helped by an entity that is funded by us or entities that are funded by us, maybe is the way forward.
Maybe one reaction on the financing of SMEs. There is a gap. We acknowledge that on the financing of SMEs by DFIs. We are trying to find some solutions and develop new instruments, new offers, so that to try to fill that gap. Over the past years, when it comes to the agribusiness specifically, we have tried to strengthen the agro franchise of the commercial banks we are working with, so that they can take more risk on the agro sector and have a better knowledge and strengthen their risk assessment and grow their portfolio in the agribusiness, because as Hans said in the previous panel, we are not equipped to directly finance SMEs. We have not the sufficient back offices, we would not be flexible enough, etc. for SMEs, so we are not that well equipped to directly finance them, but through intermediation, either through financial institutions or through large corporates, which have supplying contracts with a large number of outgrowers, SMEs. We can touch them, but directly, I think it remains a challenge, and not sure we would be able to be flexible enough to meet SMEs' demand.
I think I'm in agreement in that we, as DFIs, we need to identify and acknowledge our limitation in terms of delivery, then design products that's starting to solution for these challenges. We have what we call agro-linkage scheme, where we will identify a large processor who has a need for throughput. We then share risk, where we making sure we give them the funds to on land, but we're making sure that they're not making money in the lending, because that's not their domain. But we do allow a certain portion that they can use just for cost recovery. Then they on land to small farmers. And because they're also interested in the quality of the product, so part of what we will then put in place will that they have to give that technical support as well as extension support to these farmers. So a farmer gets secure a market while a processor secure throughput. So it becomes a win-win situation.
Well, it's good you raise that point, because IDC, being the local DFI, the South African DFI, you obviously know the ecosystem better. You're sitting closer to the entrepreneurs, to the banks, to the funds. What kind of complementarities do you see between the role of you DFIs and other DFIs based in Europe, for instance?
I think, again, the issue of reach and additionality. We don't necessarily have to all be in the same place and compete. We could tailor product, or if you are a DFI based in another locality, but you want to have an impact elsewhere, you can design your product and say, I want to target women-owned businesses, so we will channel these funds. This is the criteria that we're looking for. Obviously, a challenge that we find, IDC do manage quite a number of funds, third-party funds. The challenge is where you have say it's a European-based DFI, they will like the regulatory, let's say it's phytosanitary requirements to meet European standards, even if the produce is not going to be exported to Europe. Those are some of the challenges. So the alignment is important, especially when you have to start entering into such discussions.
Atsuko?
I just wanted to build on what my IDC colleague was saying. I think one of the most important things that we've realized recently is the need for working capital. As much as we want to provide CapEx to the companies that on a long-term basis that we would like to finance, they're needing the working capital to be able to buy from farmers. So if we could have these healthy linkages between, you know, the financing we provide as DFIs and like an IDC, that would be fantastic, because that combination of the working capital that we cannot provide is provided by an entity like IDC. So I would love to partner in that context.
You agree?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if we can, for every rand that we put in, we can be able to leverage and be able to attract 2 more, it means the impact can be bigger. And I think maybe I may just take advantage that now that I have the platform. I think as DFIs also, one thing that we can do is we have the local intelligence. We know where the demand is. One thing that we are doing is we sometimes get involved even in project development, where we see opportunities in certain commodities. We go out, we literally buy a piece of land and start experimenting with that particular commodity, and if it's successful, we then help to establish the industry. 18 years ago in South Africa, blueberries was not classified as one of our commodities. Today, we're talking close to 20,000 tons that is being exported. That's now we're having this new industry, and blueberries are mainstream. We got involved in a farming operation that we bent our fingers that we didn't have access to genetic material. As a result, the farm failed. But in doing that, we created that sort of a curiosity in that, then that gave birth to a new industry. We even helped set up the industry body which we finance. Recently, we've done the same, or we're in the process of trying to help put organized almond industry together. I think our role is not only limited to funding, but it's also creating opportunities in the space.
Thank you. And Ruggero, you bring an interesting perspective because you're a fairly new GFI in that space. So in that context, how do you see the involvement of CDP? What value can you add?
Yes, thank you, Alex. It is true. We are fairly new because we opened our door in 2018. Although CDP has been around for 170 years, but it was more focused on the domestic business. CDP is also the national promotional institution. In 2018, we received a mandate from the Italian government to use our own resources to do cooperation development. This means that we cannot provide any concessional loans. So for the moment, our tools are mainly debt at market rates. We don't do equity. We can provide guarantees, but we just started. So we had this is the starting point. On Agri, again, we don't have a fully dedicated team with Agri experts. We are taking a more broader approach, where we have a corporate dedicated team that is looking also at agribusiness transactions. From a corporate point of view, we have done with Atsuko Cocobod in 2019, and the appetite to do more is definitely there. Of course, you have to understand that we have some limitations being new. First of all, we have no local presence, so it's really challenging for a DFI that is only sitting in Rome to source transactions across Africa. So we really need to team up with the other DFIs if we want to play more in this in the sector. And again, like other DFIs, we cannot touch SMEs. So the only way for us is to finance local financial institutions, which we are doing, and when we want to do more. So going forward, the strategy is, in the last years, we have been focusing also on assisting Italian companies to invest in developing countries. That's quite obvious. There are many Italian companies active in the sector, especially in machineries, agro-processing, packaging, irrigation. So we are assisting them. But this doesn't mean that we want to be tied to Italian economy, so we want also to get knowledge of international companies. We want to work with them. We want to support them. And as I said, in parallel, we will keep financing local financial intermediaries for financial institutions for really trying to get involved more with smallholders, farmers, cooperatives, all these things that we really want to finance, but we cannot directly.
Thank you. So looking forward to seeing you at the next Indaba and talking about your achievements. All right, so there seems to be a broad consensus about the importance to join force, but recognize the difference and make sure we all align on topics sometimes a bit difficult, like standards and others. It's a bit boring when everybody agrees, so let's try to have a bit more provocative question. And the question is, do you think that DFIs should work more at a macro level, solve global issues, save the world, or rather focus at a very micro level and just, build solid, dynamic companies, strengthen them, and make them grow? Roman, do you have any view on that?
Yeah, I think we're all private sector investors, and at the end, if you look at our portfolios, we invest in companies, and we back management teams that make those companies tick and happen and grow. And I feel sometimes we pick up the macro trends. We have macro aspirations. Food security is being the one at the forefront at the moment because of the war in Ukraine. And on the micro level, I'm sure my fellow colleagues receive many opportunities, which are projects. Now, projects are not businesses. Projects tend to be greenfield opportunities where a lot of DFIs stay away from. Projects tend to be in primary agriculture, and Andreas earlier mentioned the challenges. So when we have these Indabas in the years to come, I think it will be pleasing to see more companies, more corporates, more businesses, more management teams talking to us. I think Norman this morning highlighted, the challenges that a corporate has in approving a particular investment, and we all know that from our daily work. So that's, I think, my aspiration, more corporates, more companies in these kind of forums.
I fully agree with what you said, Roman. We are dealing with, we are private sector arms, we are dealing with corporates, so basically we tend to focus on the micro side, but at the same time we have a critical role to play on macro trend. So when it comes to AFD, we have taken strong commitments with regards to climate, and Proparco will not bring the solution for climate, but if in any project we can push some climate angle and help our counterparts to assess their risk when it comes to climate and exposure to climate risk, and put in place some action plans and include that in their strategy, that's already a starting point, and it can also be taken as an example for other entities. And it's also a mean for them to mitigate their risk. When we talk about primary crops, primary agriculture, it's risky, but if we have a clear view on where are the risks and how we can help the corporate mitigate those risks, then potentially we might be able to sometimes take that risk. Not all the time, but sometimes take that risk. So I think, to come back to your question on the macro side, we clearly have a role to play on some big topics such as food security, climate, etc. Yeah.
Thank you, Claire. And I think that also echoes what Natalia from EBRD said before when she listed all the impressive results that EBRD achieved in terms of policy dialogue. It all started from financing of companies. That's what really gave the leverage of EBRD to then push forward a policy agenda. But Atsuko, you wanted to react.
No, maybe this is more of a question. This year, one of the transactions, sorry, let me go back to the question. First of all, I think it's really important to think big, to think transformation, to scale. And as DFIs, I think we have to go beyond the businesses we finance to the Africa we want. And in that context, one of the transactions we worked on this year was to try to provide a guarantee to mobilize European sovereign wealth funds into African agricultural assets. And unfortunately, it didn't work. For not many reasons, but okay, so it didn't work. But I think one of the things that we as DFIs need to think about is how do we play a catalytic effect in terms of African sovereign wealth funds investing into African agriculture as assets. I actually had a conversation with a farmer here, Dirk, who is a farmer in South Africa who has been requested by the Kenyan Investment Authority to take his skill to Kenya to do more grapes. We need more of these stories where we as DFIs can actually leverage or catalyze the patient capital that exists on this continent. Thank you.
Yeah, Anne?
I think it's a tricky area to really generalize, because while we are all bundled under the header DFIs, we all got different mandates, we've got different stakeholders with different agendas, and we've got also slightly tweaked investment strategies. And while I certainly agree that, yes, we all obviously want to achieve a similar target, we've got very different ways to get there. And I personally believe that's not wrong. So I think that there are certain players of us who've got a heavier weight and can work on the policy. I think some of us was really just a dedicated private sector focus. We are really more bottom up, and I think that's where we are catalytic, because working with the businesses, addressing risks, as Claire said, to really say, okay, we want to leave a business which is better, more profitable, sound, employs more people, pays more taxes, does more for the economy they operate in, really goes to our DNA. And I think through that we've got a catalytic role, because then subsequently they are more investable by other players. And I think that's where the differences come in. Even they might be subtle, and we might all be clubbed together, but that's where the IDC can go in earlier, has the possibility to start things. We might come in at a later stage, but through all of this, we all try to really be supportive, to add with different mechanisms to leave better businesses, and through that really attract more funding. It doesn't take away from the need to work on policy. I completely agree to that, but I think there's also within our community, there's different players with different strengths to really play to that. And I think that's, again, to the point, who is who, and how can we really support each other on that.
Maybe to comment on that again from the equity side. And one of the things I guess we need to see in order to close the loop is also to see more successful exits in the market, because we've already seen great success stories. But in order to attract more African private capital, we need to start closing that loop and creating that exit market, that secondary market, so that we can demonstrate that actually a return can be made in these markets. So I think that's going to be the next step.
And maybe also the earlier point where you asked is like, there more capital or more opportunities? And I think there's still a disconnect between the two. And I think that's also where it is really a two-way street, because it's not only about DFIs, and now I bundle us again, although I just said we should be more separated. But DFIs pushing money into the market, it's also the way, how are projects prepared? How far are you? And with all due respect to all entrepreneurial parts, but it's very difficult to judge a proposal of someone that, okay, I've got an idea, I don't really have the land, I don't have money, I don't have the experience, but I want to go for something, and then you're disappointed if you get a no. So it's a two-way street. Do the homework, especially now with the whole transformation elements. Know how you can contribute. Those are very important triggers to really also attract interest, to say, okay, what's my carbon footprint? How can I actually be positive? If I want to grow a product, how's the route to market? And I think that's an area where DEG's played a lot. We had a cold chain and storage business in Namibia to really help to also then trade export into the region. And we started out of Namibia, grown into South Africa, into Zambia now, with a lot of support. But I think it's obviously the backbone. It's not primary act, but it obviously all facilitates and helps. There needs to be a road. And I think that's where the broader mandates to also really look at the infrastructure backbone, facilitating trade. The free trade agreement was mentioned earlier, is all important steps in order to achieve a common goal in the end.
What role can TFIs play to increase that capital mobilization? Because as Johanna mentioned, you're facing that problem very concretely when you have to exit an investment or refinance a loan. Roman, any views on what really TFIs can do at the level?
I think my view, it's easier to influence regulation and policy once you're an investor in the business. I think that Natalia mentioned this example of what EBRD and other DFIs have done in Ukraine. If you look at what they've done, and she knows everything, I don't know very much about them, but you can see that there were some world-class businesses built in Ukraine, which meant that Ukraine became a key player on the world stage in food. And, you know, when the war hit, actually we hear a lot of atrocities, but the country's kind of fed. They have food, and actually the world is suffering because Ukraine can't export. So if we can build world-class businesses in Africa with our capital, you know, of any size, whether it's medium-sized businesses or larger businesses that go global or go regional, that's important, and that allows us the platform to, you know, influence regulations and really for our voice to be heard. You know, I sit on the board of Zambeef, where Frank and myself were on the board for quite some time, and, you know, when Zambeef speaks to the regulator, you know, they listen. They may not do things always, but at least they really pay attention, because you're a very important player in the country or even in the region.
Thank you for that. And Claire, I think you were the first to mention climate, and many of the participants actually just came straight from the COP. How do you see that DFI can maybe foster more climate-oriented initiatives in the sector? That's also a question to all the panelists, but I guess everybody's asking it these days.
Actually, I see it twofold. The first one is talking about climate, making some education to our counterparties, explaining where are the risks, what are the challenges, what are our commitments, etc. And the second is provide resources, either financial or assistance or technical, etc. So that to help our clients be more ambitious on the climate angle. So, for instance, we can participate financially to carbon footprint assessment, to climate risk assessments, so that to identify the areas of risk and then build some kind of action plan, and then the implementation of those actions can be included in the financing we are considering. So this is the type of long-term approach that can be put in place so that to have an action on climate. But on this specific topic, I think we still have to learn and be more innovative in what we consider climate. I think we are still a bit limited and maybe a bit shy on what we consider climate. Today, it's obvious that solar panels or I don't know, optimized irrigation, etc., is climate eligible, but there are many other things that are less tangible and that can have a clear impact on climate. So we have to get stronger on that and assume that it's not an exact science, and that we have to allow a test and learn approach to our clients. So they will put means, we will try to help them, etc. But it can fail, but we have to try at least. So this is something we are trying to push with our shareholders, with our regulators, etc. But they reply that we need to have clear guidelines, etc. But we are trying to push that approach, and we still have to work on that, I think.
Yeah, I think one can include the ESG-related things in the scorecard, development scorecard, and give incentives for. That's how you can encourage it. And in any case, in our case, and I think probably all the DFIs, the funders already are demanding that. It's not like you really have a choice. We already, as the IDC, our funders are saying we cannot be, for example, fund the fossil fuels. Obviously, it's not in the agri space, but as we getting those line of credit, they're already coming with terms, but we can also make it part of our DNA. And as we also lending or on lending and put it as part of the development scorecard, but incentivied so that it can be seen as a necessity, not necessarily as just a matter of compliance.
Thank you. Any other comment on what TFIs can do about climate in the sector at your level? But yeah, Atsuko?
Thank you so much. I think the climate is changing, farmers are adapting, and so therefore DFIs need to support farmers to be able to adapt faster. And so there is a lot of climate financing in the world, and so we've been able to mobilize some climate finance, but that means we work with companies to be able to apply some of the adaptation measures. So for example, the Agri SME catalytic financing mechanism, which my colleague Ilyas is working on right here, that's one way to show how climate finance can help us to be able to support farmers through aggregators. I think the second way is, there was a lot of conversation today around cold chain and logistics, and this whole issue around post-harvest, which causes a lot of, carbon. So I think that's another way. And thirdly, we're talking about more resilient, shorter supply chains on the continent. So really in terms of the carbon footprint, that really shortens things. So I think because there is climate finance available, we need to be able to articulate what we are doing to be able to access that finance and ensure that supply chains are much more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll ask another question, but maybe if someone in the audience has any question, make yourself visible, and in the meantime, I'll ask the question. I think we heard many times discussions about blended finance today, and from your perspective, can blended finance help you to do a better job? And if so, what do you need? That's an open question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, especially if we are to scale farmers, sometimes it's not always the lack of a great idea. You find that the business is viable, it's good, they're doing well, but the challenge is that maybe they're operating below the optimal scale. So with blended finance, at least you sort of bolster the balance sheet, and they can be able to take on more senior debt to expand their business. So we've seen it works.
Sorry, I might be the provocative one here, but I think blended finance is sometimes a bit of a blessing and a curse at the same time. Because obviously for us, we want to build sustainable businesses who last not only from an environmentally sustainable and climate sustainable, but also from a financial sustainable way. And so that you need to be able to operate in your financial environment. And unfortunately, we have a reality that a lot of our local interest rate environments on the continent are extremely high because we do face inflation. And most of those markets. And I think that's sometimes where we need to find the right balance between obviously helping to start, but also keeping a business in check that it's financially viable in future. And we are not offering a solution and a helping hand for a few years, but then a facility stops and suddenly you are faced with drastic change in your funding costs and you can't actually operate under those conditions. I think that's very much a case-by-case individual analysis, but where it's also important to really assess those. And for us, from a DEG perspective, that's obviously where we work a lot on the technical assistance and business support service side to say, okay, we're not necessarily making it cheaper for you, but we help you to get better in order to improve your quality. And through that, maybe we help businesses in Madagascar to get lychees organically certified so they could achieve higher margins in the export market in Europe. And through that, then you are better equipped to access the next step. But it's almost a philosophical question, and I don't think there is a right or wrong. It's just you can't always say that only lower rates are necessarily better in order to equip you for the future.
Thank you. Roman?
Yeah,
Maybe Frank was trying to get the figure for investment in Africa agriculture, and let's say it's half, it's 25 billion, which is a big number. I think that 25 billion comes with technical assistance. I think all of us do it. We also try to give catalytic capital. There are plenty of foundations that deployed many millions of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on the continent. In my mind, and I agree with a point just now, what's missing actually is commercial capital on the other side. Because if we say we're going to deploy that 25 billion, even with modest returns over 5 to 10 years, we need to get 35 billion back in hard currency from our markets. And that currency has to come from somewhere. So it needs to be corporates, it needs to be capital markets. Natalia mentioned what has been done in Turkey and other sort of developed markets that are further ahead in their development. We need to have that capital, because through that capital we would be able to take our money and basically reinvest it again into more needy subsector situations which still need our involvement. And I think DFIs in Eastern Europe probably demonstrated that in the likes of Poland, which needed a lot of DFI money 20, 25 years ago, but now it's largely commercial investors who are there, and corporates, and there's a capital market that is quite buoyant. So for us, my feeling is getting that hard commercial capital to exit us or repay our loans or help our GPs to make money is what's missing, not blended finance, concessionary capital. There's plenty of it in Africa.
I don't think blended finance should necessarily be seen as a way of just propping up a business that is not viable. It's important that the fundamentals are right. You then help this business just to get to the next level. And as DFIs, we also then have to realize that we're not trying to compete with commercial banks. We're trying to get these guys up to a point where now they can go straight to commercial banks and be able to raise capital. I think that's the whole idea. But if we are going to use blended finance to support marginal businesses, yes, of course, it will be just that vicious cycle, because the next round they will still need the same support. The idea is to look at the businesses that just need that push to be able to cross the line. Then the next time they won't even have to be the ones going to the banks. Their bankers will be offering them more, and we've seen it especially in long-term crops in citrus and all that in South Africa, where we started with some of now today they are large players. When they started, and they didn't even have land, they used communal land where they entered into long-term leases when commercial banks shied away from them. 7 years on, when those orchards started maturing, they started seeing success. When we tried to advance more commercial capital, we could not compete with the banks. But we looked at it as a positive thing, because we unlocked value, we de-risked those businesses. I think that's what we should look at as DFIs. Thanks.
Atsuko, you wanted to react?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think all of us would say none of our credit risk committees, no matter how we have some sort of first loss facility or restructured, would allow us to go ahead with a company that's not financially viable. So I think that's one. But there are externalities which I think blended finance or that concessional finance can actually help with. But just to be a little bit maybe asking a question, I mean, upstream market development is kind of blended finance also, right? It's a kind of support which is given to a company to be able to have a longer runway. But I just feel with the way that, for example, and I hope there is an IFC colleague here, because it's never good to talk about a colleague behind their back, but like IFC has a lot of money for upstream market support, and I think that has to be not proprietary, but actually leveling the playing field for DFIs to be able to work with companies. And I feel that if a DFI has that opportunity to provide upstream market, it's not because only that DFI can do that deal. I think that would be a little bit of a pity with regards to upstream market support.
Thank you. And Claire, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, actually, blended finance can take multiple forms. It can be used to reduce interest rates. And in such case, I think we have to be quite careful not to compete with a commercial bank, as you said, and also also to make sure that we will not have one specific company benefiting from a lower rate, while the competition, their local competitors, do not benefit from that rate. So it would be dumping, and there's no real justification for that. So it can take the form of lower rates. It can also take the form of de-risking, and I think that there is some leverage for us because we know that we thought that the agro-business is more risky. It will be complicated for us to have our credit appetite moving or evolving in that sense. So, but there might be some projects on which we can invest if we have the possibility to de-risk thanks to blending finance. So we can use it for that. And the third form I have in mind is more grants or technical assistance, and I have in mind some examples of large corporates operating in very remote areas, and besides their core business, they have to invest in many infrastructures, roads, housing, accommodation for the employees, medical centers, etc. This is not their core business, and maybe and they're playing a social role through those investments, and maybe we could provide some grant pockets for that type of investment. Yeah, because this would, in developed countries, this would be taken in charge by the public authorities. So, yeah, I think this is something on which we can work, but reducing interest rates, we have to be careful, I think.
I think IFC's upstream development is fantastic, but I think only IFC and maybe one or two others can do it just by size. You know, they're probably as big as all of us put together, and it's a function of operating capability and commercial capability, and also being present pretty much in every developing market in the world. So when you have scale and you have ability to apply certain things that you develop, products, knowledge, across so many markets, you can have it. I think, you know, I can speak for us, you know, it was something that was proposed under our new investment strategy. It hasn't been implemented, and I think probably the reason for it is just operationally, it's very hard to do. But it's a great offering if you can do it.
Thank you. So let's turn to the audience. I think we had two questions, one here and one here. So please.
Good afternoon. My name is Anne Thompson. I'm based here in Cape Town. 10 years ago, I attended a conference in London, apropos the country of Togo, and it was about food and agriculture, and that sufficient food, the conclusion was sufficient food was produced worldwide, just 50% of it was wasted. I attended a similar conference about 4 years ago here in Cape Town about food supply, and exactly the same conclusion was reached. Now today is a historic day in terms of our planet because, as announced by the United Nations yesterday, we've hit 8 billion in terms of population. What does the panel think in terms, and I don't want to even go 10 years, in terms of the next 5 years and how to ensure that the levels of starvation, i.e. food supply, and the maximized resources that Africa produces actually works well for Africa? Thank you.
So who's brave enough to take that question first?
Yeah, I can maybe start. When we talk about impact, we talk a lot about food security. But at the same time, a lot of the investment, historically also DFI investment, has gone to export products. For natural reasons, it's often more stable cash flow, better margins, hard currency revenue. But at the same time, the domestic food value chains have remained quite underinvested. So I think that's probably where the DFI should start turning their focus next. And there are many reasons. As we've heard today, the poor yield of agricultural land, the high post-harvest loss. But if we could start channeling more CapEx investment to the primary production, catering the local markets, and bring up that yield and lower the price of food for the consumer in many of the sub-Saharan Africa countries, I think that would tackle a lot of the challenges.
I think we need to, obviously as DFIs we operate in particular localities, and I think we need to, and there was a question earlier whether DFIs do have a role in influencing policy. I think we need to look also at comparative advantage. If I were to just look at South Africa, its position in terms of our climate and what we are able to do. In terms of grains, I think we're doing fairly well. We're always having surplus. But now if we were to look at, say, production of, or the inputs that go into animal feed, the war in Ukraine and Russia happen to be the largest supplier, among the largest suppliers of that. But if you now look regionally, South Africa, if I take poultry again, while we still not self-sufficient, but we the largest producer, if we were to look at, say, Zambia, they have the right climate. So in South Africa, our country, we have different microclimate. We actually a semi-arid country. Then you look at some of the neighboring countries like Zambia, good climate for some of these commodities, say like soybeans. We could, as a region, look at who is able to do what. That's where now the issue of comparative advantage comes in. We could even invest in, as South Africa, invest in Zambia in the crushing and all that processing of the soya. Then import the product into South Africa to push it through our value chain, then supply some of our finished product in the form of meat, chicken, back to Zambia. Not that they shouldn't develop the industry, but by doing so, it's not us pushing all the products towards them, but we also buying value-added product from them. So I think we don't necessarily, all of us have to produce everything, but we have to look at what is suitable for our environment.
I agree. I think we have to be reasonable also about what we expect from TFIs. The key factors behind driving food insecurity are not lack of food or food loss, but it's mainly conflicts and policy, and there is little TFIs can do about that. But Atsuko, you wanted to say something?
No, thank you for the question. I think it's really important to believe that it's possible, that Africa can actually provide food and be able to feed itself. So at the African Development Bank, really the combination of having the political will to really push the agenda, as you mentioned, around some of these key commodities, the regional integration aspect around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and really ensuring, as we have seen, the growth of intra-regional trade of agro-processed foods, the growth of these cities, and just trying to ensure that we can keep up with the population. I think we have to believe that it's possible. And with agriculture, because the agricultural seasons, you can get productivity enhancements relatively quickly. It is just about that political will and organization of resources.
One question, 4 different answers. Now we move to the gentleman in the front. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to, if the session and the day is about agri-investment into Africa and the role that the DFIs play and what can and they do more and better of, I would just like to say that the role of the DFIs in Africa in agriculture cannot be overemphasized. It is an incredibly important partnership, And without DFI investment in Africa, I can't see the sector growing and I can't see it surviving. So I think the importance of the DFI's participation cannot be overemphasized. I would like to just sketch a scenario and then finish with a question. For the last 12 years, I've been on boards of companies ranging from export cropping production to the value chain, to the cold chain, to grain production in Africa, to chicken, poultry conversion, et cetera, et cetera. And the context I'd like to sketch from a commercial capital's point of view is the following. We were hearing 25 to 40, $50 billion available. Rowan was saying, you know, the commercial capital will need to follow, otherwise this will not work. And the session's topic is how can we do more or better? So here's the context of commercial capital. When you invest in agribusiness, there's no denying it that without farms, there won't be agri. It is a dream to think secondary processing will come and will follow if the primary part isn't stimulated. So that's the first part. If we want to say 100 years from today, food security must be addressed, Africa must be self-sufficient, etc., we will have to imagine a production and a primary production capability. Without that, the rest will all just sit on the sideline. Capital is running towards short-term, quick return investments, and therefore, by definition, commercial capital is running downstream. Where's it quick? Where can I trade? Where can I get my money back quicker? And it's leaving this enormous gap on the upstream side that nobody wants to fill. Now, in a commercial capital board meeting, for example, let's go and develop irrigated agriculture in country A. The first question is, do we trust the regulatory environment? Is there tenure of land? How long is that tenure of land? Will there be water rights? What happens if we don't get it? Can we fight those water rights? How expensive will it be to litigate? Those powers lie with sovereign bodies. Disproportionately, the power lies with governments, with DFI organizations, and your ability to deal with those if and when it turns against you. But in the commercial world, that is a nightmare. Fighting for water rights in certain areas in Africa as a commercial capital party, it's just not possible. You eventually just give up and leave. So that's the context. Now the question. If you look at agricultural land as an asset class around the world, over the last 100, 200, 300 years, it's been an incredible asset class. It goes up over time. But the problem with commercial capital is you've got to go and borrow, buy, develop, interest rates, and the unfortunate entrepreneur on the other side cannot keep up. The money is just too much. So I would like to pose a challenge to the DFIs, is to think of the land and the infrastructure development a bit differently. If I were in a DFI's shoes, I would say to myself, I don't really mind country risk 30, 40, 50 years from today. I'm just thinking out loud. Government-to-government ability to negotiate these things are stronger. So it may be possible for DFIs to take a 20, 30, 40, 50-year view on land, particularly developed agricultural land, that has infrastructure on it, that will be inflationary linked, but the commercial capital will not do that. And then to ask the entrepreneur to put a disproportionate amount of money into the operations, the shorter term capital. And I think commercial capital will follow in a much more accelerated manner. So the question I'd like to end with, sorry for the long scenario, is if the DFIs really want to mobilize commercial capital, will they be prepared to look at the land and the infrastructure slightly differently than bundling it with the capital requirements that the commercial parties have to bring to the table?
So, sorry, you're talking about like pure farmland investments, right? Any?
Norman, maybe I'd try. I think if you look at the examples of this in developed world, you've got people like Westchester who basically do that in Central Europe, United States. I can't remember all the regions they're doing it. But the key to that model is, they're banking on the capital appreciation that you mentioned, that this land will be more valuable, but they have very capable operating teams that operate the land and cultivate whatever that land can produce and sell, so it's a yielding asset over 5, 10, 20 years. And it's an aggregation play, so you're talking about, tens of thousands of hectares. I don't know whether that's been done in Africa. It's very difficult, but I think it comes down to the management teams that can take on the aggregation challenge and the operational heavy load that one needs to give comfort to institutional investors that can work. Because on the asset side, it's kind of almost like a real estate investment, because you think that the agricultural land will be more and more valuable over time in a particular country, region, etc.
Yeah, I also wish I had a positive answer, Norman, but I think it's extremely tricky because the first scenario which jumped onto my mind, and please allow me to say it, was just like reputational risk around it. Because having then especially European DFIs, maybe it would be different if the IDC does it in SA locally, but to think that we would own large portions of land in Africa, you immediately get the wrong headlines associated with it. So I'm not sure if that's really a problem the DFIs could solve, or if we need to think about local ownership structures to really have a community tie to still give the longevity of an investment and help there. But I think to actually buy own land and then help on the commercial side, I'm all for the aggregation, but I'm not sure if then the DFIs are the right owners in that part. Maybe I'm too skeptical. It's like when you build up your scenario, I immediately saw headlines popping up in my mind, and I think that's obviously also always one part we need to consider from a reputational perspective and also obviously from a distribution perspective. But I think the long-term part, that doesn't necessarily scare us. I think all of us have done very long-term investments, but we need a bit of visibility around the cash flows, and that's obviously the part where we all always struggle.
Yeah, let me give it a shot as well. I think it's more also, I'll say, competing priorities, especially if you're having DFIs that are in multiple sectors, because you have to manage sustainability of the organization. If you check, most of the time, and the DFIs that normally fall into trouble is where they borrow on, I mean, they issue a bond of 5 years, but their lending horizon is 20 years. So they just have to pray that nothing happens sovereign-wise, so the country continually, it's got a high rating, then they can keep on rolling. So they're living on that. But as soon as something changes and the lenders call on their capital, everything else collapses. So it's more of a balancing act. And another thing is DFIs that are state-owned is even a challenge, because when coming to mandate, is also dictated by policymakers.
Okay, so thank you very much for that question. Actually, the whole inspiration behind the special agro-industrial processing zone is just to do that, to take the CapEx portion of an investment of a zone so that the OpEx portion is all the private sector has to look at, and then the margin between the revenue and the expenditure is such that the private sector will really want to invest. Where you're bringing in new ideas for me, just listening to you, is about, it's not just the processing. We have to have private sector commercial investors looking at the production portion. And I think this is something that I'll take back, and we'll brainstorm around that. But for us, the idea of working with governments on a concession to be able to build the infrastructure is something that, as the African Development Bank, we're very happy to support, and we believe very much that this is part of the structural transformation that we need to have to be able to have commercial agriculture on this continent.
So thank you for these two excellent questions. I'm afraid it's time to finish, but let me ask one final question, if you still have enough strength to stand another 5 minutes. It would be great if you could just take half a minute maximum to answer to that question. Just the same question for everyone. Today we heard a lot the words challenges, risk, GFIs not being equipped, but Christmas is coming. And you know, that's a season where dreams come true. So let's imagine you could ask for one thing to be changed for you to do more and better in the sector. That can be something internally, more capital, bigger teams, external, more project, more capital. What would that be? Which higher risk appetite? I don't know. What would that be which will you dream about and will help you to do a better job? We started with Johanna last time, so Atsuko, you first.
Okay, thank you so much. I wish our credit risk committee would be kinder to us in agriculture. No, I'm just joking. Okay, so I look forward to a very strong partnership with the DFIs, with the companies, and I feel like as a platform, I wish we could work together to ensure that the private voice of agriculture is reflected in government commitment so we can really accelerate the transformation in Africa. Thank you.
For us, it's easy since we start from a blank page. So for sure, we would need a credit committee and shareholders that want to increase their risk appetite. And of course, probably hiring more really agri-specialists within our team to know better the sector. And also the risking tools might help.
Thank you. We need to invite the credit officers next time at Indaba. Huh?
Yeah, I can only support. As I said, we are trying to push for the risking tools, and I'm hopeful that the current agenda and the food safety challenge will help building the case and help us obtain that kind of resources. But I think that, as we said, there is a clear need. We really feel that most of our counterparties try to do their best, but feel a bit alone because they have to fight every day against many things, authorizations, infrastructure, I don't know, finding staff, etc. So I think that they also need to feel, and we will also be more comfortable. They also need to feel that their business environment goes in the right sense and is getting more sophisticated, so that they can do their business. And this could be a real kicker for us to invest more, I think. But it's a dream, I think.
I spoke to a developed markets investor a couple of months ago, and he's a very experienced guy. He's been investing in agriculture for 30 years, but mainly in developed markets. And he said that there could not be a better time to invest in food and agriculture than now, given where the prices are and the emphasis on food security. So for me, I repeat what I said earlier, if there's more and more interest from corporates, institutional investors, anybody, frankly, outside of this group and the previous group to invest in our sector, it would be fantastic. It will make our job much easier. We'll have like-minded partners, investors, exits, etc.
For me, I'll say collaboration, especially regionally, where different DFIs are represented. I think we can make more meaningful impact. But locally, working with corporates, we as a team, we looked at different large players in the space, especially processors as well as retailers. Some, their procurement spend in local currency, they're sitting at around 100 billion. And I'm just imagining if we were to partner with them, because always what they're saying is that, no, we cannot find these people who can supply us. If we could have that partnership where we guaranteeing funding, if they also somehow can sort of guarantee the offtake, I think. So collaboration basically across the board, I think that can take us somewhere.
Can I wish for more wishes? I think it's a complex part. I don't think there's the one solution for all. I think it goes from the regulatory side, as Norman touched on with this question around land, to really have reliability on land title, to actually plan, have a long-term perspective, through the infrastructure to actually be able to transport goods from A to B and not get stuck at a border without maybe a working cold chain and wasting product there, all the way obviously through the interest rate and cost environment, and really having that push for younger businesses to really start and get the upstream part, which was quoted so often, to really get it going. Do I think it's realistic that DG gets into that space? Completely no. But can we build on other strengths in order to support and really add onto each other? That's what I would hope for.
I'm going to end with what I started with. So we need a bit more of courage. We maybe need a bit more of risk appetite, but we also need good stories. We need those Pan-African champions to attract the private capital, because as we all know, DFI money alone cannot solve all the problems. So that would be my wish list.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Santa has a good wish list. But yeah, thank you for the participation and for the attention.
Just to close, no. I think we did a fantastic job. Alex, you did a fantastic job. We are 10 minutes late for the whole program. With such a charged program, I think we did pretty good. The only thing that's left for me is to sign off at day chairman. Tomorrow I'm not a day chairman. I hand over to Andrew McInerney tomorrow, who will play the role of day chairman, and to invite you to a networking cocktail, who's just outside here. You have earned double portion for staying so long. The ones who are already there will be chased out at 6 o'clock. Okay, thank you very much and see you tomorrow.